Hello everyone, if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me, and let's get started. Picture Europe in the years before 1914. Every summer brought its parades. Rows of troops marching in spotless uniforms, brass bands blaring, flags snapping in the breeze. Leaders gave speeches about unity and peace, but always with a note of warning, as if they knew peace was fragile, more like a truce than a guarantee. If you open a newspaper in Berlin, Paris, or London, you'd see political cartoons depicting rivals as lumbering brutes or sneaky schemers. The headlines were bold, national pride was high, and the idea that your country was the rightful leader of Europe was hardly controversial. It was common sense. But underneath the showmanship was tension so thick you could almost taste it. Militaries were getting bigger. Governments were stockpiling weapons. And worst of all, the continent's nations had tangled themselves into a web of alliances that, on paper, looked like protection, but in practice, it was more like standing in a room full of loaded mousetraps. All it would take was one wrong move for everything to snap. On the surface, alliances are supposed to prevent war. If everyone promises to defend everyone else, then no one dares to attack, right? That was the theory. In practice, Europe's alliance system before World War I was more about suspicion than trust. You had the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. It wasn't a single binding treaty, more of a handshake agreement made up of smaller, separate understandings. Britain and France had been rivals for centuries, and Russia didn't exactly love Britain's global empire. Still, they found common cause in keeping an eye on Germany. Then there was the Triple Alliance: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. This looked tighter with formal military agreements. But Italy had its own ambitions, many of which clashed with Austria-Hungary's. If war broke out, no one could be certain Italy would actually show up. And as 1914 proved, they didn't. The real danger was that these alliances worked like a row of dominoes. If Austria-Hungary got into trouble, Germany was obligated to step in. If Germany stepped in, France and Russia might respond. And if France was involved, Britain would likely follow. What could have been isolated skirmishes risked turning into full-blown continental wars. It's a little like promising all your friends that you'll back them up in any bar fight. Noble, maybe, but if one friend has a bad temper, you might find yourself throwing punches at people you've never met. If the alliances were Europe's loaded mousetraps, the naval arms race was the sound of someone cocking the hammer on a revolver. Britain had ruled the seas for more than a century. Their two-power standard meant their navy had to be bigger than the next two largest navies combined. It wasn't just pride, it was survival. Britain was an island nation. If the Royal Navy couldn't control shipping lanes, the country could be starved into submission. Then came Kaiser Wilhelm II's Germany. Wilhelm was fascinated by the sea. His grandmother had been Queen Victoria, and he wanted a navy to match Britain's. Under Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, Germany poured money into battleship construction. And not just any battleships. In 1906, Britain unveiled the HMS Dreadnought, a revolutionary design faster, more heavily armed, and more armored than anything afloat. It made every other battleship obsolete overnight. Germany responded by launching its own dreadnought program. Shipyards roared with activity. Steel production skyrocketed. Every new keel laid was reported in the newspapers, often with a hint of menace. Germany launches another giant warship. It became less about actual war plans and more about prestige. Like neighbors in a suburb competing over who has the biggest, flashiest car, Britain and Germany were locked in a very expensive contest. The problem? Warships can't be parked in a garage if things get tense. They're built to be used. Some grudges fade with time. This one didn't. In 1871, after the Franco-Prussian War, Germany, then led by Prussia, humiliated France. The French army collapsed, Paris was besieged, and in the peace treaty, France had to hand over Alsace-Lorraine, a region rich in coal, iron, and symbolic value. To make things worse, the treaty was signed in the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles, the ultimate insult. For decades afterward, French schoolchildren learned geography from maps that showed Alsace-Lorraine shaded differently, often with captions like "lost, but not forgotten." Military planners dreamed of the day it would be taken back. Politicians promised it would be restored. By the early 1900s, this wasn't just about territory. It was about national pride. France's Plan 17, its military strategy, was aggressive, aimed at a swift attack into Alsace-Lorraine if war came. This wasn't defensive thinking. It was revenge dressed up as strategy. And here's the thing, Germany knew it. That knowledge shaped Germany's own war plans, which assumed France would attack immediately. That's how grudges work. They warp not only how you feel, but how you prepare for what's next. If Germany's problem was two hostile neighbors, Austria-Hungary's problem was that it could barely hold itself together. This empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups: Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Poles, Italians. Each had its own language, culture, and, in many cases, ambitions for more autonomy or outright independence. The biggest headache came from the south. Serbia, a small but fiercely proud kingdom, saw itself as the champion of Slavic peoples in the Balkans. Many Serbs lived inside Austria-Hungary's borders, and Serbian nationalists dreamed of uniting them under one flag. For Vienna's rulers, this was a nightmare scenario. If the Slavs pulled free, the whole empire might unravel. So Austria-Hungary kept a close, suspicious eye on Serbia, sometimes treating it less like a neighbor and more like a dangerous intruder lurking at the fence. The Balkans had a reputation for trouble. Winston Churchill later called the region the powder magazine of Europe, and he wasn't exaggerating. In 1912 and 1913, two Balkan wars shook the region. First, a coalition of Balkan states, Serbia, Greece, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, attacked the Ottoman Empire, driving out of almost all its European territories. Then, barely a year later, those same states turned on each other over the spoils. The wars left everyone edgy. Serbia doubled in size, alarming Austria-Hungary. Bulgaria felt cheated and resentful. The Ottomans wanted revenge. And Russia, as a self-proclaimed protector of the Slavs, felt obligated to support Serbia, just as Austria-Hungary felt it had to contain it. The Balkans were like a live grenade sitting in the middle of the European dining table. Everyone knew it was dangerous. No one could agree on how to move it. It's easy, looking back, to wonder why no one seemed scared. But the truth is, most Europeans in 1914 weren't terrified of war. They were almost excited by the prospect. Nationalism had been building for decades. Textbooks, parades, and newspapers celebrated each country's history and military. Military service was a rite of passage for young men. Uniforms were worn with pride. The idea that war could be quick and glorious still had currency. This wasn't just propaganda, it was military doctrine. Generals across Europe subscribed to the cult of the offensive. The belief was that modern armies, with their railways and rapid mobilization, could win wars in weeks if they struck fast enough. The horrors of industrial warfare, machine guns, artillery barges, trench stalemates, were either underestimated or ignored. When war finally came, soldiers marched off with flowers in their rifles and cheers from crowds. Home by Christmas wasn't just a slogan, it was a genuine expectation. If the public mood was eager, the press helped whip it into a frenzy. Newspapers weren't neutral observers, they were political actors. In Germany, Britain was portrayed as a jealous bully trying to strangle German ambition. In Britain, Germany was shown as a swaggering upstart, hungry for domination. French papers still seethed about Alsace-Lorraine. Serbian papers glorified resistance to Austria-Hungary. Sensationalism sold copies. Outrage made readers come back for more. Politicians read the papers, too, and some tailored their speeches to feed the same emotions. It was a feedback loop. The public's appetite for patriotic drama fueled political rhetoric, which the press then amplified. The result? When tensions rose, there was little room for calm diplomacy. Every move by a rival power was interpreted in the most hostile possible way. By the summer of 1914, Europe wasn't a calm continent occasionally disturbed by quarrels. It was a room full of mousetraps with a live grenade rolling across the floor. The alliance system ensured that any spark could set off a chain reaction. The arms races meant those reactions would be deadly. The grudges, nationalism, and press-fueled hostility guaranteed that no one would back down easily. The morning of June 28, 1914, was already heavy with symbolism before the first shot was fired. Sarajevo's streets shimmered under the summer sun, and the city, nestled in the hills of Bosnia, was buzzing with anticipation. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come for an official visit. The empire's dignitaries wanted this to be a display of authority and benevolence. The locals? Well, let's just say their enthusiasm was uneven. There's an almost absurd irony in what happened that day. If a driver hadn't made a wrong turn, the Archduke and his wife Sophie might have lived. If one young man hadn't been in the right place at exactly the right time, the Great War might have been delayed, or maybe even avoided altogether. But history is full of those knife's-edge moments, where a handful of coincidences tilt the whole world. Sarajevo's assassination wasn't just a political murder. It was the trigger that yanked Europe into 4 years of slaughter. So, who exactly was Franz Ferdinand, the man whose death sparked all of this? On paper, he was a classic heir apparent, eldest son of Archduke Karl Ludwig, nephew of Emperor Franz Joseph. But his personality didn't exactly scream beloved future ruler. He was stubborn to the point of arrogance, blunt in a way that offended the court's delicate egos, and prone to making political enemies without much effort. Even those who agreed with some of his ideas often found him exhausting to work with. One of the defining dramas of his life was his marriage to Sophie Chotek. She was noble, yes, but not noble enough for the Habsburg strict hierarchy. Their union was considered a morganatic marriage, meaning Sophie would never be empress, and their children would have no claim to the throne. This was not just a polite snub, it was enforced humiliation. At court functions, Sophie was often excluded from standing beside her husband. For Franz Ferdinand, this created a long-standing resentment toward Vienna's old guard. And yet, he wasn't purely reactionary. He had ideas, radical ones for the empire's inner circle. He favored a more federalized structure for Austria-Hungary, giving greater autonomy to its many ethnic groups. To some, this was visionary. To others, especially Hungarian elites who feared losing their privileged position, it was dangerous nonsense. In short, Franz Ferdinand had no shortage of critics, both at home and abroad. To understand why his visit to Sarajevo was so risky, you have to understand Bosnia's place in the empire. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina, a move that infuriated Serbia and Russia. Serbia had seen Bosnia as part of its national destiny, a piece of the puzzle in creating a greater Slavic state. The annexation wasn't just territorial, it was an insult. Bosnia itself was a patchwork. Orthodox Serbs, Muslim Bosniaks, and Catholic Croats all lived under Habsburg administration. For some, the empire brought modernization, railroads, new schools, a bit of urban development. For others, it felt like an occupation. Economic opportunities often went to outsiders. Political power was centralized in Vienna and Budapest, far from Sarajevo's narrow streets. By 1914, resentment had been simmering for years. The idea of Yugoslavism, uniting all South Slavs into one nation, was gaining popularity, especially among students and young intellectuals. That idea wasn't just political theory, it was a rallying cry. Serbia itself was hardly a model of political stability. Since the 1903 coup that overthrew and quite literally murdered the old royal family, the army had held a powerful grip on politics. Out of that coup culture grew the Black Hand, a secret nationalist organization officially called Unification or Death. They weren't shy about their methods. Assassination, sabotage, and propaganda were all fair game. The Black Hand had a blurry relationship with the Serbian government. Some officials supported them. Others feared they'd drag Serbia into war. But the group had a clear goal: unite all South Slavs under Serbian leadership. Bosnia was central to that dream. Enter Gavrilo Princip. Born in a small Bosnian village to a poor peasant family, he was the archetype of the radicalized youth. Smart, politically aware, and deeply resentful of imperial authority, Princip gravitated toward nationalist circles in Belgrade. He was slight, often sickly, and yet carried the kind of intensity that made him seem larger than life to his comrades. For young men like Princip, martyrdom wasn't a tragedy, it was the ultimate statement. Killing a symbol of the empire could, they believed, light the fire of liberation. The plan to kill Franz Ferdinand was daring, but not especially sophisticated. 6 conspirators, armed with pistols and bombs, positioned themselves along the Archduke's motorcade route in Sarajevo. Their hope? At least one of them would get the chance to act. The first would be Assassin Froze. The second, Nedeljko Kabranovic, hurled a grenade, but it bounced off the folded-down roof of the Archduke's car and exploded under the vehicle behind. Several people were injured, but Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were unharmed. Kabranovic swallowed cyanide and jumped into the river to avoid capture, except the poison was old and the river was shallow. He was pulled out, arrested, and beaten by an angry crowd before the police dragged him away. The Archduke continued his schedule, clearly shaken but determined to carry on. Later that morning, he decided to visit the wounded in the hospital. The motorcade set off again, but the driver took a wrong turn, right onto a side street where Gavrilo Princip happened to be standing outside a cafe. Princip stepped forward, pulled out his pistol, and fired 2 shots at near point-blank range. One bullet hit Sophie in the abdomen. The other struck Franz Ferdinand in the neck. Sophie, don't die. Stay alive for our children," he reportedly cried as they slumped in the car. They were both dead within minutes. News of the assassination raced through Vienna and across Europe. Public mourning was arranged, but behind the scenes, not everyone in Austria-Hungary's elite was heartbroken. Franz Ferdinand's death removed a politically troublesome figure. Still, the symbolism of the act, a Serb killing the heir to the throne, was a gift to hawks who wanted a reckoning with Serbia. In Serbia, the reaction was mixed. Many ordinary people were horrified. They understood the danger such an act could bring. But among nationalist hardliners, there was a sense of grim pride. The Black Hand was not an official arm of the state, but the line between government and radical networks was fuzzy enough to cause suspicion abroad. Newspapers amplified the drama. In Vienna, headlines screamed of Serbian treachery. In Belgrade, editorials warned against Austrian aggression. In the cafes and clubs of Europe's capitals, people began quietly speculating that this was no local affair, that bigger powers would soon get involved. In the days that followed, Austria-Hungary's leadership faced a choice: punish Serbia with diplomacy or crush it with force. Many in the government, especially Foreign Minister Leopold Berchtold, favored military action. But what with Serbia risked war with Russia, Serbia's ally? Enter Germany. On July 5th, Kaiser Wilhelm II and his advisors assured Austria-Hungary that they would support any action against Serbia, no matter what. This became known as the blank check. It wasn't just a diplomatic promise. It was an encouragement to act aggressively. Berlin's reasoning was cold. Germany feared being encircled by Russia and France in the future. A war now, they believed, might be winnable before Russia's military modernization was complete. Austria's crisis with Serbia offered the perfect spark. Austria-Hungary waited nearly a month before acting, partly to prepare militarily, partly to ensure international optics. On July 23rd, they issued an ultimatum to Serbia with deliberately harsh terms, allowing Austrian officials to participate in investigations on Serbian soil, suppressing anti-Austrian propaganda, and more. It was designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted most of the demands, but refused the clauses that undermined its sovereignty. For Austria, this was the excuse they wanted. Russia began mobilizing in defense of Serbia. Germany mobilized in defense of Austria. France mobilized in defense of Russia. Britain tried to mediate, but was pulled in when Germany invaded Belgium. What began as a crime scene in Sarajevo had, within weeks, become a European war. Looking back, it's tempting to see the assassination as inevitable, the war as unavoidable. But history is full of near misses. If Kabranovic's grenade had worked as planned, perhaps the shock would have been the same. If the driver hadn't turned down that side street, maybe Franz Ferdinand would have gone home safely, his political plans still in play. The chain of events was both deliberate and wildly accidental. 2 bullets on a Sarajevo street didn't just kill an archduke and his wife. They cracked open the fault lines of a continent, releasing decades of tension in one catastrophic burst. And in the echo of those gunshots, the 20th century truly began. Picture Europe in July 1914. The heat was heavy, the kind of summer where cobblestones shimmered in the midday sun and cafe awnings drooped lazily over streets thick with cigarette smoke. Politicians were still holding conferences in ornate rooms, clinking coffee cups, and pretending they could still control the situation. The rest of the continent? They were reading newspapers about some archduke shot in Sarajevo. A tragedy, sure, but nothing to cancel summer plans over. And here's the thing. Almost no one, outside a handful of jittery diplomats, thought this was going to turn into the Great War. The British were more worried about suffragettes smashing windows. The French were arguing about taxes. The Germans were talking about harvest yields. And the Russians? Well, they had their own mess with strikes and unrest. What nobody quite grasped, except maybe the generals in their war rooms, was that Europe's military systems were like a row of mousetraps, each loaded and primed, sitting way too close together. Once the first one snapped, the rest would spring in a chain reaction so fast you wouldn't even have time to yell stop. If you've ever tried to stop a train after it's already rolling at full speed, you'll understand what Europe's mobilization plans were like. Every major power had one, beautifully detailed in maps and timetables, with arrows drawn in confident strokes showing exactly how armies would flow across borders. On paper, it looked like genius. In reality, it was a straitjacket. Take Germany's famous Schlieffen Plan. It was basically, if war with Russia is coming, hit France first. Hard, fast, through Belgium. Why? Because Germany figured Russia's huge army would take weeks to fully mobilize. And in that time, Germany could knock France out of the war, then turn around and deal with Russia. But there was a catch. The whole plan depended on moving immediately, down to the hour, once mobilization began. And that wasn't just a German thing. Russia's military machine was even worse in some ways. Their railways were scarce and overburdened, so their generals knew if they didn't start early, they might never get moving at all. Austria-Hungary had to shuffle troops between fronts against Serbia and Russia, another logistical nightmare. The problem? Mobilization wasn't like warming up a car. You couldn't just pause it. Once you started, the other side saw you starting and had to respond, because if they waited, they'd be behind and vulnerable. So, one country's precautionary move looked like an act of war to everyone else. It's almost comical, if it weren't so tragic. The diplomats were still exchanging polite cables about peace proposals, while trains full of soldiers were already chugging toward the borders. The generals had the timetables in hand and were saying, in effect, look, we can't just stop. The plan is in motion. And maybe that's the part that still chills historians. Once the machine started, no one, not kings, not prime ministers, not ambassadors, could really stop it. I can keep going straight into the domino effect of declarations of war, carrying this same mix of human texture, conversational tone, and historical precision. If you try to follow the exact order of who declared war on whom in late July and early August 1914, your head might spin. It's like watching a bar fight in slow motion. Someone throws a punch, someone else grabs a chair, and pretty soon half the room is swinging at each other, even the ones who didn't know what the fight was about. It started, of course, with Austria-Hungary's ultimatum to Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Serbia accepted most of it, rejected a few clauses that would have gutted their sovereignty, and figured maybe they could negotiate the rest. Austria-Hungary wasn't in the mood for half measures. On July 28th, they declared war on Serbia. Russia, seeing itself as Serbia's protector and eager to push back against Austrian influence in the Balkans, began mobilizing. Germany saw Russia's mobilization as an immediate threat. Remember those timetables. And on August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France had a treaty with Russia, so Germany sent them an ultimatum demanding they stay neutral. Paris basically shrugged and started mobilizing. So on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. Then came the move that would bring Britain into the fight. Germany's Schlieffen Plan ran right through neutral Belgium. The Belgians said no. Germany invaded anyway. And on August 4th, Britain, bound by treaty to protect Belgium, declared war on Germany. By that point, the domino line had tipped over completely. Austria-Hungary versus Serbia-Russia versus Austria-Hungary, and Germany versus Russia, and France-Britain versus Germany, and soon, the Ottoman Empire and Japan would join their respective sides. What's striking is the speed of it. This wasn't a slow slide toward conflict, it was a sprint. Within just over a week, all the major powers in Europe were officially at war. There's a grim kind of poetry in it. Each country felt it was acting in defense, either of allies, territory, or their future security. Yet, in acting defensively, they all ended up creating the largest offensive war the world had ever seen. Here's the part that feels almost surreal when you look back at it. In the capitals, Berlin, Paris, Vienna, London, the outbreak of war didn't bring panic. It brought celebration. Crowds flooded into public squares. Flags waved from balconies. Military bands played rousing anthems. In Berlin, people marched through Unter den Linden singing Die Wacht am Rhein, as if they were heading to a festival. In Paris, tricolor flags were everywhere, and the Marseillaise rang out from cafes. Vienna's Ringstrasse became a sea of Austro-Hungarian colors. It wasn't just the young and fit. Entire families turned out, mothers pushing prams, old men tipping their hats to passing soldiers. The newspapers fed it too, printing stirring headlines about duty and honor, about defending the fatherland or standing with our brothers. Some of it was genuine patriotic fervor, some relief that uncertainty was over, and some was just social momentum. When everyone around you is cheering, it's hard not to join in. Of course, not everyone was caught up in the fever. In every city, there were quieter pockets, people who had lived through earlier wars, or who read the situation with more dread than pride. A few seasoned politicians and journalists muttered that the cheering would stop once the casualty list started arriving. But their voices were drowned out in the roar of drums and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. For now, the guns hadn't fired in earnest. For now, war was still an idea, grand, noble, and to many intoxicating. You've probably heard the phrase before, they thought it would be over by Christmas. It's one of those historical cliches that's so familiar, it's easy to forget that people really believed it. Why? Part of it came from precedent. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 lasted only a few months and ended decisively. The Balkan Wars of 1912 to 1913 wrapped up in under a year. In the public imagination, modern war was quick, efficient, and if not painless, at least limited. Leaders reinforced the idea, partly because they believed it and partly because it was good for morale. Telling people they were heading into a drawn-out, grinding conflict wasn't exactly a recruitment slogan. Much better to promise a swift, glorious campaign. Even some generals were convinced. German planners genuinely thought they could crush France in 6 weeks. Russia believed sheer numbers would overwhelm the Central Powers before the snow fell. Britain figured its navy could strangle German trade into submission within months. It was a comforting illusion, and one that would cost millions their lives. Nobody, not even the most cautious war minister, was truly factoring in what industrialized warfare with machine guns, modern artillery, and massive conscript armies would do to the pace and scale of battle. By the time Christmas 1914 actually came, the Western Front was frozen in place, the trenches filled with mud and misery, and the idea of a short war was something soldiers joked about bitterly over cold rations. In the first weeks of August 1914, recruiting offices in every major city were swamped. Lines formed before dawn. Young men, farmhands, shop clerks, students jostled each other on the pavement, trading jokes about how they'd get there before it's all over. And that wasn't just bravado. Many really did worry they'd miss the war if they waited too long. It sounds absurd now, knowing what was coming, but back then the idea of a short, decisive campaign meant there was a genuine fear of being left out of the big moment. The propaganda worked overtime. In Britain, Lord Kitchener's mustachioed face pointed from posters with the now iconic "Your country needs you." In France, illustrations of heroic infantrymen bayoneting the enemy flooded kiosks. German recruitment broadsheets promised adventure and honor, with clean-shaven young men marching beneath banners into golden sunsets. Of course, motives were mixed. Some enlisted out of patriotism, others because their friends did, so were pushed by family expectations. A few saw it as a way to escape dead-end jobs or unhappy home lives. And then there were the romantics, dreaming of galloping cavalry charges and medals pinned to their tunics. What's striking is how naive most were about the reality of combat. Many assumed they'd fight in a handful of sharp, glorious battles, see a bit of Europe, and be home by New Year's. They had no concept of the grinding attrition, the mud, the hunger, the sheer industrial scale of killing that lay ahead. Recruitment officers didn't disabuse them of those notions. Why would they? The goal was to fill the ranks, and in those heady first weeks, that wasn't hard. In Britain alone, nearly 30,000 men volunteered on a single day in early September. If the mobilization plans were the war's machinery, the first troop departures were its theater. Railways became the arteries of Europe's armies. Trains rolled into stations already humming with crowds, their engines hissing, carriages stuffed with men in fresh uniforms, rifles slung, faces eager. On the platforms, scenes played out that, to later generations, would seem unbearably bittersweet. Sweethearts clung to soldiers' arms until the last possible moment. Mothers pressed food parcels into their sons' hands. Children waved little flags, beaming with pride. Brass bands played over the roar of steam and the shouts of officers trying to keep the boarding orderly. The soldiers leaned out of carriage windows, waving caps, tossing jokes and promises to write. Some sang regimental songs. Others smoked quietly, eyes scanning the crowd for one last glimpse of home. It wasn't just a matter of sending men. Entire armies had to be shifted like chess pieces. Germany's rail network was a military marvel, moving hundreds of thousands of troops toward the Belgian and French borders in precise sequence. Russia, with fewer and slower trains, struggled to move its vast manpower west. Britain, relying on the Channel crossing, ferried the first units of the British Expeditionary Force to France, where they would march toward the front in crisp formation, cheered by French villagers along the way. There was an undeniable sense of drama in those first movements. They felt like the opening act of something epic, before the script turned grim. The opening weeks of the war had a strange energy, part parade, part high-stakes gamble. The mobilization was flawless in its precision, the declarations of war almost theatrical in their timing, the early troop movements full of ceremony and optimism. But just beneath that surface, the cracks were already there. The battles that followed in August and September, the Marne, Tannenberg, the frontiers, would shatter illusions at a speed that rivaled the declarations themselves. By the time the first winter set in, the words, "over by Christmas," would be muttered with the same tone you'd reserve for a cruel joke. The war that began as a swift, almost glamorous affair would bog down into a nightmare of trenches, shells, and mass graves. And yet, in those early days, the machinery of mobilization, the cheering crowds, the rush to enlist, all of it seemed to say the same thing. We're ready. Let's get it done. History, as it turned out, had other plans. In August 1914, Europe still wore its old illusions like a crisp parade uniform, pressed, polished, and completely unsuited for the mud ahead. Politicians promised a quick war. Newspapers carried maps that made the whole thing look like a chess match. Even soldiers joked they'd be home before the leaves fall. And then the first real battles hit. The change came fast, like a storm rolling in over a sunny picnic. One moment it was bright flags, cheering crowds, and brass bands playing Johnny marches. The next, choking smoke, fields littered with the dead, and the awful realization that the machine gun and modern artillery had made old battlefield heroics a kind of suicide. By the end of that first month, even hardened officers were stunned. The war they had prepared for, one of rapid maneuvers and decisive charges, was already gone. The French called it Plan 17. On paper, it had the elegance of a confident gamble. Mass French armies would storm into Alsace and Lorraine, reclaiming the provinces lost in 1871, and break the German lines before the enemy could fully mobilize. It was the military equivalent of throwing the first punch, hard enough that your opponent never recovers. The reality? Well, reality had a nasty habit of kicking back. In late August, French troops in their blue coats and bright red trousers, a uniform straight out of the 19th century, marched into a wall of German bullets and shellfire. Commanders still clung to the idea of the offensive à outrance, the belief that sheer courage and determination could overcome any defense. But in the age of smokeless powder and rapid-fire weapons, that faith was a death sentence. Imagine standing in an open field, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of other men, when the first heavy shells start to land. The air splits with the flat crack of Mauser rifles. Machine guns chatter like typewriters gone mad. Men fall by the dozens, then by the hundreds. By nightfall, entire regiments are gone, not just defeated, but erased. The numbers were obscene. In a matter of days, France lost more than 75,000 men killed, with hundreds of thousands more wounded or missing. Villages were turned into charnel houses. Forests in the Ardennes, meant to be cover for French advances, became killing grounds as German defenders cut them down like harvest grain. And yet, commanders on both sides still thought in terms of just one more push. They were addicted to movement, convinced that the next attack might be the one that broke through. But each push only fed more lives into the grinder. By the time the month ended, the Battle of the Frontiers was really a patchwork of disasters. Charleroi, Ardennes, Lorraine, each telling the same grim story. Courage was no match for concentrated firepower. The war had barely begun, and already France's fighting spirit was bloodied, though not yet broken. If the Western Front was chaos and slaughter from the get-go, the Eastern Front began with something that almost looked like hope, at least for Russia. Germany's war plan had banked on one big assumption. Russia would take weeks, maybe even months, to fully mobilize its massive army. After all, this was a country where railways were patchy, telegraph lines unreliable, and vast distances slowed everything down. But by mid-August 1914, Russian troops were already moving into East Prussia. That wasn't just ahead of schedule, it was ahead of German expectations by a mile. Two separate Russian armies, one under General Rennenkampf, the other under General Samsonov, marched in from different directions. The early reports were encouraging. German forces in the region were outnumbered, and their commanders were more worried about the Western Front. For a brief, heady moment, it looked like Russia might steamroll through East Prussia, threatening Berlin itself before the German high command could react. But this is where early war optimism collided with the messy truth of running a campaign over hundreds of miles. Russian troops moved fast, but their supply lines didn't. Soldiers were sometimes marching on half rations. Ammunition shipments lagged, and the two generals, Rennenkampf and Samsonov, couldn't stand each other. Their personal feud was infamous, the kind where orders got lost and coordination was about as smooth as two rival shopkeepers trying to share the same street corner. Meanwhile, the Germans started shifting reinforcements east. Enter two names that would become legends, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. These men had a knack for reading the battlefield like it was a chessboard, and they saw a glaring opportunity. The Russians had pushed deep, but they were clumsy about covering their flanks. Worse, their radio messages were being sent in the clear, no encryption. German operators could basically eavesdrop on their plans as easily as tuning in to a sports broadcast. Still, in those first weeks, Russia's forward momentum was real. Villages fell, German civilians fled, and for a moment the Eastern Front looked like it might be the stage for an early Allied victory. But As the next chapter shows, those first gains would come crashing down in spectacular fashion. By late August 1914, Russia's two invading armies in East Prussia were like two boxers swinging wildly without watching their guard. Rennenkampf's force in the north was pushing forward after a win at Gumbinnen, while Samsonov's army in the south lumbered deeper into enemy territory. The plan, at least on paper, was for them to squeeze the Germans between them. The problem? They weren't actually talking to each other. Their personal feud had gone from petty to dangerous. Rennenkampf wasn't going to march his exhausted men to help Samsonov, not after some half-remembered slight during the Russo-Japanese War. Samsonov, meanwhile, pressed ahead without reliable intel, assuming the Germans were on the run. He didn't know that German headquarters was reading his radio messages like a gossip column. Hindenburg and Ludendorff, fresh from being called out of retirement and staff work respectively, seized the moment. They decided to turn their full force south, leaving just enough troops to watch Rennenkampf. Using their rail network like a switchblade, they shifted divisions rapidly and quietly. Samsonov's army, already strung out over poor roads, walked right into the trap. The encirclement happened fast. On August 26th, the Germans hit Samsonov's flanks hard. Panic set in as Russian units realized they were being surrounded. Communications broke down entirely. Messengers lost, wires cut, orders arriving hours too late. By August 30th, Samsonov's Second Army was in ruins. Around 50,000 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded, and more than 90,000 were taken prisoner. Samsonov himself didn't make it back. Facing the humiliation of reporting such a disaster to the Tsar, he rode into a quiet forest at dusk and shot himself. His body wasn't recovered until days later. Tannenberg wasn't just a military victory for Germany. It was a morale lightning bolt. In the West, their armies were still grinding forward toward Paris. But in the East, they just crushed a much larger enemy force with precision and speed. For Russia, it was the opposite, a gut punch that exposed just how fragile their war machine really was when leadership and logistics faltered. Next, we swing back west, Germans near Paris and the panic that followed, where the Schlieffen Plan nearly pays off in full. Wanting to push straight into that. By early September 1914, the German war plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, was doing exactly what it was designed to do. The French armies had been mauled in the Battle of the Frontiers. The British Expeditionary Force, though stubborn, was too small to stop the tide. And now, after weeks of relentless marching, German troops were sweeping down through northern France, skirting Paris from the north, aiming to hook around and crush the French army from behind. It looked, from a distance, like the knockout blow was only days away. In Paris, the mood shifted from patriotic fervor to barely controlled fear. The French government, sensing the danger, evacuated to Bordeaux. Public buildings took on a strange, half-abandoned look, with papers stacked on desks and dust already settling on chairs left behind. Citizens who could leave fled south. Those who stayed behind braced for siege, stocking up on bread and coal, scanning the skies for the first sign of German airships. The panic wasn't unfounded. German cavalry patrols were already within 30 miles of the city. Artillery could potentially be brought close enough to shell the outskirts. And rumors, the kind that thrive in wartime, flew faster than any official report. Some swore that German spies had infiltrated bakeries to poison bread. Others claimed the French army was already in full retreat and that the city would fall without a shot fired. But here's the strange part. For all their momentum, the German armies were running out of steam. Weeks of constant marching had worn men down. Supply wagons lagged behind. Horses dropped dead from exhaustion. And the right wing, the tip of the Schlieffen Plan's great hook, was stretched dangerously thin, its flank exposed. It was an opening that French commander Joseph Joffre saw and decided to gamble on. The stage was set for one of the war's most famous battles, one that would pull Paris back from the brink and force the Germans to retreat for the first time since the invasion began. The German advance had been so fast, so relentless, that it seemed unstoppable. But in early September 1914, Joffre, calm to the point of seeming stubborn, ordered a massive counterattack. This wasn't just bravado. He saw that the German right flank was overextended, angled toward the southeast instead of sweeping in behind Paris as planned. If the Allies hit hard enough, they could wedge themselves into that gap and throw the whole advance off balance. From September 6th to 12th, French and British forces slammed into the Germans along the Marne River. The fighting was brutal. Riverside villages turned into fortresses, wheat fields churned into mud and corpses. The French soldiers, many of them exhausted from weeks of retreat, fought like men who knew this was the line that could not be crossed. And then came the moment that's still retold, half history, half legend, the taxis of the Marne. Paris's military governor, General Gallieni, needed to rush reinforcements to the front, but the railways were jammed and there was no time to reorganize. So he commandeered hundreds of Renault taxis, the kind that normally ferried Parisians to dinners or nightclubs, and sent them east, packed with troops. The sight must have been surreal. Long lines of black and red cabs rumbling through the night, headlights dimmed, engines rattling, each one carrying 5 armed men. In raw numbers, those taxis didn't change the course of the battle, maybe 4,000 men in total. But psychologically, they were dynamite. For the soldiers arriving in them, it was a morale boost. For the public, it became a symbol of national unity, the city itself rising to defend the country. Even the Germans, hearing of it later, recognized the audacity. By September 12th, the German right wing had been pushed back. The Schlieffen Plan, that meticulously timed dance of armies, was broken. The retreat north set the stage for the race to the sea and, eventually, the static hell of trench warfare. Paris was safe, but Europe had just traded one kind of nightmare for another. By the time the smoke cleared in mid-September 1914, the war everyone thought would be short and decisive had already chewed through hundreds of thousands of lives. The front lines hadn't collapsed in a victory for either side. Instead, they'd hardened. In the west, the Germans dug in along high ground, and the Allies followed suit. Trenches began to snake across the landscape, shallow at first, then deeper, more elaborate, more permanent. In the east, Russia reeled from Tannenberg, but kept pressing, forcing Germany and Austria-Hungary to fight on 2 sprawling fronts. The early optimism, the dream that a single battle or bold maneuver could end it all, was dead. What replaced it was something colder, the realization that this war was going to be a test of endurance, resources, and willpower. The soldiers knew it before the politicians did. Men who had marched off to martial music now huddled in muddy dugouts, staring across no man's land at an enemy they might never actually see. Families at home stopped asking, "When will you be back?" and started saying, "Stay alive." Europe had entered the war in August with bright flags and brass bands. By September, it had traded them for barbed wire and the dull thud of shells landing just out of sight. The real war, the one that would grind on for 4 more bloody years, had begun. Picture this. It's late 1914, somewhere along the muddy stretch of the Western Front. The grand hopes of a quick, decisive war have long since faded into something else. An endless, grinding stalemate that no one quite knows how to escape. The once green fields are scarred with shell craters and churned to thick, sticky mud that clings to everything, dragging boots down like quicksand. The sky is often low and gray, a heavy blanket that seems to press down on the trenches and the men inside them. At first glance, it looks like 2 sides staring each other down across a no man's land, a terrifying expanse of barbed wire, broken trees, and abandoned equipment. The war that had raced across Europe in summer's heat had now slowed to a crawl, locked in place by trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles, running like a scar across the continent. It wasn't the war anyone signed up for. The cavalry charges, the swift maneuvers, the thunderous breakthroughs, they were replaced by this new reality, a brutal, grinding contest of survival in ditches barely wide enough to stand in. And yet, beneath the horror and the hardship, there was something deeply human unfolding. Friendships forged in mud, moments of unexpected kindness, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. The phrase race to the sea sounds almost like a fun, competitive event, maybe a foot race along the coast. In truth, it was neither fun nor fast. After the German advance was halted near Paris at the First Battle of the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other by pushing north, desperately seeking an open flank to exploit. Each time one army extended its line, the other scrambled to meet it. There was no sudden, victorious sprint, just a slow, grinding extension of the front line, with trenches being dug faster than any grand battle plan could be executed. This relentless sidestepping went on through September and October 1914, stretching the front northwards and ultimately forcing the lines all the way to the North Sea coast of Belgium and France. By the time the race ended, the Western Front had turned into a solid wall of trenches from the Swiss border to the sea, about 400 miles of fortified positions that would remain, more or less, unchanged for the next 4 years. Suddenly, the war wasn't about sweeping offensives or dramatic cavalry charges. It was about holding the line, digging deeper, and learning to live in a new kind of battlefield. Nobody had planned this. The generals of 1914 were still thinking about wars of movement and decisive battles, the kind that had defined Europe for centuries. But reality had other ideas. Soldiers dug trenches first to take cover from the hail of bullets and shells. Those shallow holes saved lives. But soon, those holes grew deeper and longer, linking up into networks and defenses that spread like veins across the landscape. Trenches were rough and dangerous at first. Soldiers had to crouch low to avoid enemy fire, often exposed to the elements and constant threat. But over time, the men became surprisingly ingenious at making these grim ditches livable. They built wooden duckboards on the muddy floors to keep feet dry, or at least a little less soaked. Sandbags piled up along the edges turned fragile earthen walls into near-impervious shields against bullets and shrapnel. The trench system itself was layered and complex. Frontline trenches were the closest to the enemy, where fighting was fiercest and constant vigilance necessary. Behind these were support trenches, where reinforcements waited and supplies flowed. And even further back were reserve trenches, places where soldiers could get a brief, much-needed rest before returning to the front. These trenches were linked by zigzagging communication trenches, a clever design to prevent the enemy from firing straight down a long line, a deadly risk if trenches ran straight. It was, in every sense, a war of attrition. The trenches weren't just places to hide. They were battlegrounds, homes, prisons, and sometimes, strangely, places of camaraderie. The defenders had a terrible advantage. Killing had outpaced protection. Machine guns and artillery could sweep open ground mercilessly. Barbed wire quickly became the most hated invention on the battlefield. Originally meant to keep cattle from wandering, it was now stretched across no man's land in thick, tangled webs designed to slow attackers to a crawl. It forced soldiers to halt and cut through the wire with pliers, exposed to enemy fire every second. Sandbags might seem simple, just sacks filled with dirt, but they were lifesavers. Piled along trench walls, they absorbed bullets and shrapnel that might otherwise tear through flesh and bone. Soldiers scavenged wood, iron, and even old doors to reinforce their shelters, fighting a constant battle against collapse under bombardment. Then there were dugouts, holes dug deep beneath the trenches, sometimes carved into hillsides or reinforced with timber and corrugated iron. Early on, there were little more than holes in the ground where men huddled against the cold and damp. But soon, especially on the German side, dugouts became surprisingly elaborate, multi-room underground shelters with bunks, stoves, and electric lighting. It wasn't luxury by any stretch, but it was a small pocket of refuge in a hellish landscape. If the trenches were tough in summer, winter was something else entirely. The first winter of the war was brutal and unrelenting. Freezing rain soaked the men day after day, turning trenches into icy rivers of mud and water. The cold crept through clothing and bone alike, leaving soldiers shivering in their boots, if they even had dry boots at all. Trench foot was a nightmare. Prolonged exposure to damp and cold made feet swell and rot. Soldiers tried anything to keep their feet dry. Some stuffed straw or newspaper into their boots. Others rubbed grease or candle wax on their skin. Medics did what they could, but amputations were common. Improvisation became a way of life. Soldiers would layer newspapers under their uniforms, build makeshift stoves from empty tins, and craft rudimentary shelters from whatever scraps they could find. Letters home often mention the cold as much as the fighting. If it doesn't kill us, the frostbite just might. And yet, despite everything, there were moments of humor and warmth. A shared joke over a burnt meal, a rare exchange of chocolate or tobacco, a friendly wager on which rat was the fattest. Amid the endless misery, December 1914 offered a strange, fleeting miracle. The guns fell silent on parts of the Western Front for Christmas. It began with carols, voices tentatively carrying across no man's land, from German trenches to British ones. Silent Night, answered by Still Nacht. Then men began to climb out of their trenches, hesitantly at first, weapons slung, hands raised in peace. British and German soldiers met in the frozen mud, shook hands, exchanged cigarettes, shared chocolate, and even played impromptu games of football. Imagine that, a match played in the middle of a battlefield where, days before, bullets had sung death songs. This wasn't a grand, coordinated ceasefire. It was spontaneous, a human moment that the high commands on both sides found deeply unsettling. Letters and diaries from that Christmas capture the bittersweetness of the moment, a rare glimpse of shared humanity in a conflict designed to strip that very thing away. Outside the stories of heroism and horror lies the daily reality of trench life, a routine made up of tiny, endless tasks and little moments of normalcy. Each morning began with stand to, when every soldier was jolted awake before dawn to prepare for possible attacks. The front line was always tense, but mornings were especially fraught, as attacks often came with first light. After that, it was chores, repairing wire, filling sandbags, cleaning rifles, and keeping watch. Meals were cold and unimaginative. Canned beef, nicknamed bully beef, stale bread, hard biscuits, and weak tea. Some days the food was barely edible, others were just plain missing. The smells were overwhelming: sweat, mud, smoke, rotting flesh, and the ever-present stink of death that lingered in no man's land. Rats, as big as cats, thrived in this environment, scurrying over everything, eating scraps and carrion alike. Soldiers hated them, but also envied their survival skills. Night brought raids, small-scale attacks designed to capture prisoners or disrupt enemy lines. These were nerve-wracking operations, a mix of tension and adrenaline, with men crawling through mud and wire, hearts pounding with the fear of discovery. By early 1915, the idea of a quick war had become a cruel joke. Neither side could break through the other's defenses without paying a terrible price in blood. Attacks became costly and often futile. The Western Front was a vast, static line, a noose tightening on the hopes of both armies. For soldiers, the trenches became more than just physical structures. They were mental states, a place where hope and despair tangled. Men measured time, not in days, but in tours of duty, learned to block out the sounds of shelling, and found strange comfort in routine. It was a war of patience, endurance, and slow attrition. The waiting itself was a kind of torment, as men wondered whether this endless grind was worth the cost. Imagine you're a soldier in April 1915, standing ankle-deep in mud-filled trenches near the Belgian town of Ypres. The sky is overcast, a cold drizzle settling over the landscape that already reeks of sweat, fear, and gunpowder. You're exhausted from days of shelling, the constant threat of sniper fire, and the gnawing anxiety that anything could be your last breath. But today, something is different. You catch a faint smell like bleach or rotten eggs drifting on the wind. You look up, squinting against the gray light, and see a strange, pale green cloud moving slowly across the battlefield. There's no time to react before it reaches your position. Suddenly, your throat tightens, your lungs burn as if filled with fire, and panic spreads like wildfire. You're You're choking on air that's supposed to keep you alive. Welcome to the Second Battle of Ypres, a grim milestone in World War I, where war's rules shattered and a new nightmare began. Let's rewind a bit. Until this moment, chemical warfare had been little more than a threat whispered in military circles, a terrifying possibility, but not yet a reality. But the Germans, desperate to break the stagnant trench lines and win a decisive advantage on the Western Front, decided to roll the dice with something deadly and unseen. On April 22, 1915, under the cold Belgian skies, the Germans released more than 150 tons of chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders positioned along a 4-mile front. Here's the kicker. Chlorine is heavier than air, so instead of rising and dissipating, the gas hugged the ground, slithering into trenches and dugouts like a poisonous serpent. For the Allied soldiers, many of them French colonial troops, not fully equipped for this new horror, it was the first time they faced this invisible enemy. The effect was immediate and devastating. Men coughed violently, gasped for air that wasn't there, and some collapsed, foaming at the mouth as their lungs were burned by the corrosive gas. The scene descended into chaos. Commanders struggled to rally their men. Soldiers scrambled blindly in panic, desperate to escape a suffocating death. The gas swept across the lines, overwhelming defenses, breaking formations, and driving troops from their positions. You might wonder, why was the gas so effective? It wasn't just physical damage. It was psychological warfare at its cruelest. Facing an enemy you can't see or hear that attacks your very breath is terrifying beyond words. It shattered the illusion of control, replaced hope with helplessness. Of course, soldiers soon needed protection, but the technology was painfully primitive. At first, the best they could do was soak cloths in water, urine, or bicarbonate of soda and press them over their mouths and noses. It sounds almost laughably inadequate now, but back then, it was a lifesaver. Sometimes. The first official gas masks were bulky, uncomfortable, and far from perfect. Imagine having to fight a brutal battle wearing a mask that made breathing difficult, vision foggy, and movement awkward. Some masks leaked. Others caused panic because the wearer felt suffocated. There's a striking image in soldier diaries from that time. Men pulling their masks on and off repeatedly, trying to decide if the discomfort of the mask was worse than the fear of the gas. Others removed their masks too early, only to be overcome again by the creeping poison. In many ways, those early days of gas defense were a desperate improvisation, part experiment, part hope. But even these crude measures showed promise and spurred rapid development, eventually leading to more effective protection. Still, the early victims of chlorine gas had little mercy. If gas introduced a terrifying new weapon, machine guns solidified the sense that war was becoming a slaughterhouse. Traditional warfare had already begun to feel outdated, but machine guns forced a brutal reckoning. Picture a single weapon capable of firing hundreds of bullets per minute, turning charging troops into nothing more than moving targets. At Ypres, machine guns devastated attacking soldiers. Their bullets tore through lines, cutting down men faster than reinforcements could arrive. This wasn't just a tactical advantage, it was a transformation. Armies had to rethink everything. Charging across open ground wasn't bravery anymore. It was almost certain death. Machine guns created a deadly no-man's land where few survived. Some accounts from the trenches tell of soldiers lying face down, counting the seconds between bursts of gunfire, knowing that the slightest movement might be their last. Machine guns weren't just weapons. They were grim dictators of the battlefield, deciding who lived and who died with brutal efficiency. Then there's artillery, the constant thunderclap of war. Artillery bombardments were relentless, pounding trenches, barbed wire, and everything in between. The Second Battle of Ypres featured some of the most intense shelling of the war to that point. The tactic known as the creeping barrage involved artillery firing just ahead of advancing troops, intended to suppress enemy defenses. But in practice, this often meant soldiers had to move forward with explosions raining down around them, sometimes too close for comfort. The physical destruction was staggering. Shells tore up the earth, turning fields into moonscapes of mud, craters, and shattered trees. The landscape became a graveyard, littered with barbed wire, debris, and bodies. And the sheer, unending noise, was enough to drive any sane person to the edge. Soldiers described it as the world ending in slow motion. The smell of cordite and burnt earth filled their lungs, and every blast threatened to rip their ears apart. It was a sensory assault that broke down both body and spirit. With this constant bombardment and slaughter came something less visible but no less devastating: the psychological toll. Shell shock was the name given to the mental breakdown many soldiers experienced after prolonged exposure to the horrors of trench warfare. Initially, military doctors and officers were baffled and often unsympathetic. Soldiers showing symptoms like trembling, muteness, paralysis, or uncontrollable shaking were sometimes accused of cowardice or malingering. But shell shock was real, a neurological and psychological condition triggered by the overwhelming stress and trauma of war. Today, we'd call it PTSD, but back then, it was a mysterious and frightening phenomenon. Soldiers haunted by nightmares, unable to function, or utterly numb to the world around them were common. Families back home often heard little about this invisible wound, leaving many veterans isolated and misunderstood. One chilling account from a British soldier at Ypres described how men would break down under the constant pressure, their eyes glazed, their bodies trembling, and sometimes they just collapsed without a word. It was a slow unraveling of the human mind, forced to survive in an environment that defied reason. The Second Battle of Ypres was a turning point, not just in World War I, but in the history of warfare itself. It was the first major battle where chemical weapons were used on a large scale. It was the brutal showcase of machine guns' lethality and the horror of endless artillery barges. But perhaps most importantly, Ypres showed that war wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a grinding, merciless test of human endurance and will. The old rules were dead. New weapons demanded new tactics and caused new suffering, physical and mental alike. The soldiers who survived Ypres carried scars no one could see. The memories of choking gas, the whine of bullets, the thunder of shells, and the quiet terror of their own minds breaking under pressure. This grim legacy shaped the years that followed, as both sides dug in for a war of attrition that would last far longer than anyone imagined. When you think about the horrors of Ypres, the first gas attacks, the machine gun fire, the relentless shelling, and the crushing mental strain, it's almost impossible to imagine what kept soldiers going. Was it duty, fear, hope, or just the simple human instinct to survive one more minute, one more hour? Maybe it was all those things combined. Because even in the face of unimaginable terror, the trenches were filled with people who laughed, wrote letters, shared rations, and dreamed of home. War tried to crush them, but it couldn't quite steal their humanity. So, the Second Battle of Ypres remains a haunting reminder, not just of the deadly new face of war, but of the strength, stubbornness, and fragile hope of those caught in its merciless grip. By early 1915, the First World War had settled into a grim stalemate on the Western Front. Imagine muddy trenches stretching endlessly through the battered landscapes of northern France and Belgium. Thousands of exhausted soldiers stuck in a deadly stalemate. Every advance was measured in yards and paid for with thousands of lives. The horrors of trench warfare, the relentless shelling, the mud, the rats, the freezing cold, and the choking gas attacks had begun to sap the morale of troops and civilians alike. So, naturally, the Allies began searching for a way to break free from this grinding war of attrition. Among those eager to find a new solution was Winston Churchill, the brash and energetic First Lord of the Admiralty. Churchill's mind raced with possibilities. He was never one to sit idly by, and the prospect of a fresh front seemed to offer a way out of the mess. His plan? Strike at the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, by forcing the Dardanelles Strait, a narrow and treacherous waterway in modern-day Turkey. If the Allies could capture the Dardanelles, They could seize Constantinople, now Istanbul, the Ottoman capital, and open a much-needed supply route to Russia through the Black Sea. Sounds like a masterstroke, right? It promised to knock the Ottomans out of the war, relieve pressure on Russia, and potentially shorten the war. But here's the catch. This plan, as brilliant as it seemed on paper, relied on a chain of events that was far from guaranteed. Churchill, confident in the might of the Royal Navy, believed the Straits could be forced with a powerful naval bombardment and mine-sweeping operation. Then, a swift landing by ground troops would consolidate gains. What he envisioned was a quick, decisive victory, one that would re-energize the Allied cause. But those cliffs, hills, and hidden fortifications around the Dardanelles would soon prove otherwise. The naval operation began with a striking show of power. Imagine massive battleships, the pride of the British and French navies, advancing boldly into the narrow straits, their guns roaring. The Ottoman defenses, though, were well prepared and more cunning than many expected. The Ottomans had laid extensive minefields beneath the surface of the water, silent killers lurking unseen, ready to destroy the largest warships. When the British ships steamed forward, several struck mines, causing catastrophic explosions. The HMS Irresistible and HMS Ocean were among the ships lost, and several others were badly damaged. On top of that, the Ottoman shore batteries, hidden high up on the cliffs, rained relentless fire on the naval forces. The ships were sitting ducks in the narrow waters, unable to maneuver freely. It became clear that the Navy, no matter how powerful, couldn't win this fight alone. Minesweeping efforts were slow, painstaking, and perilous, with crews risking their lives to clear paths under heavy fire. The Ottomans used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, firing with deadly accuracy and forcing the fleet into a cautious crawl. This naval failure was more than a tactical setback. It was a psychological blow. The hope that the Straits could be forced solely by naval power evaporated, forcing Allied commanders to reconsider their approach. With the naval route blocked, the campaign pivoted to a combined operation. Troops would land on the Gallipoli Peninsula, seize the high ground, and open the way for the fleet. Enter the Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, a young, relatively inexperienced force far from home, but brimming with determination. These men had volunteered, eager to prove themselves on the world stage. Gallipoli was to be their moment. April 25, 1915, the day they landed, is seared into the memories of Australians and New Zealanders. The troops approached the beaches under cover of early morning light, their landing craft bumping on a shingle and sand. But confusion quickly set in. Maps were inaccurate, some boats were blown off course, and the beaches were not the welcoming shores anyone had hoped for. Instead, the soldiers found themselves climbing steep cliffs under heavy fire, scrambling over rocky ridges and into enemy fire zones. The Ottoman defenders, led by Mustafa Kemal, a brilliant and resolute commander, held the high ground with tenacity. His orders were simple. I do not order you to attack. I order you to die. The fighting was savage. Soldiers found themselves pinned down, unable to advance or retreat easily. Communication was chaotic, and reinforcements struggled to arrive on time. In many ways, the landings quickly turned into a costly stalemate, the kind of war of attrition the Allies were trying to avoid. This wasn't the quick, decisive blow Churchill had envisioned. Instead, it was a grinding, costly slog. The environment at Gallipoli was a relentless enemy in itself. The landscape was harsh. Rocky ridges, scrub-covered hills, narrow gullies. The blazing Mediterranean sun beat down mercilessly, with temperatures soaring in the summer months. Water was a precious commodity, and supply lines struggled to keep up with the demands of thousands of men. With little shade, soldiers faced heat exhaustion by day and bone-chilling cold by night. And then there were the diseases. Lice swarmed the trenches, spreading typhus and trench fever. Flies covered the bodies of the dead and living alike, spreading dysentery and other infections. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of sweat, decay, and unwashed bodies. Medical facilities were stretched thin. Wounded men sometimes waited days before receiving care, and sanitary conditions were grim. The rocky soil made digging proper latrines nearly impossible. Letters home from soldiers spoke less of glory and more of endurance. The endless itch of lice, the constant hunger, the despair that crept in when the dead piled up and hope seemed distant. The campaign became a test of sheer human endurance, a battle against not only the enemy, but the elements themselves. By late 1915, the grim facts were unavoidable. Gallipoli was a failed campaign. The front lines had barely shifted, casualties were staggering, and the cost in human life was mounting. A decision was made. The Allies would evacuate. What followed was a masterclass in military planning. The withdrawal was conducted quietly and efficiently, avoiding the bloodbath many had feared. But the political consequences back home were severe. The campaign became a scandal in Britain. Winston Churchill was blamed for the failure and forced from the Admiralty, his career temporarily in tatters. Gallipoli also exposed serious flaws in Allied planning, coordination, and understanding of the Ottoman defenses. Yet, even in failure, the campaign left a powerful legacy. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became the crucible in which their national identities were forged. Anzac Day is still observed annually, a solemn reminder of sacrifice and bravery. For the Ottomans, Gallipoli was a defining victory. It boosted morale, strengthened resistance, and propelled Mustafa Kemal to national prominence. He would later become the founder of modern Turkey. Gallipoli remains more than just a military campaign in history books. It's a story of courage in the face of impossible odds, of miscalculation and human resilience, of identity forged through sacrifice. It reminds us how war is often less about grand strategy and more about individuals enduring hardship, confusion, and loss. It's a chapter in world history that echoes today in the national memories of several countries, each remembering not just the losses, but the spirit of those who fought. ChatGPT said, "Absolutely." Here's a longer, more detailed rewrite of the article with richer context, emotional layers, and vivid descriptions, all while keeping that conversational, engaging tone you want. I'll deepen the historical background, flesh out personalities, and bring out the human side of these colossal battles. When you hear Verdun and the Somme, you probably think massive slaughter, right? And you're not wrong. These battles were epic in scale and tragedy, pushing soldiers and commanders alike to their limits. But beyond the staggering numbers, there's a deeper story about strategy, leadership, and the brutal reality of industrialized war that still resonates today. Picture early 1916. The Western Front has stalled into a stalemate of trenches and mud. The Germans want to break the deadlock, but instead of grabbing land, they aim to drain the enemy's strength, slowly, deliberately, ruthlessly. The phrase "bleed France white" sums it up. Verdun, a fortress town in northeastern France, wasn't a huge strategic prize by itself, but it was symbolic. The Germans knew it carried enormous emotional weight for the French, a place steeped in history and national pride. So, the idea was this: launch an intense offensive at Verdun, force the French to defend it at all costs, and inflict such terrible casualties that the French army would collapse from within. This strategy was brutal, yes, but also a gamble. The Germans knew they would suffer losses too, but they hoped the French would lose more, decisively more. It was a chilling example of attrition warfare, where the goal isn't territory, but sheer destruction of the enemy's manpower. Now, here's where the story gets human. The man charged with holding Verdun was Philippe Pétain, a general who didn't sparkle with charisma or wild strategies, but was an absolute master of defense and logistics. You might wonder, how do you keep an army alive in a place that's basically a giant artillery target? The answer: keep the supply lines open, rotate exhausted troops, and maintain morale despite unimaginable horrors. The Voie Sacrée, the sacred way, was a narrow, winding road that connected Verdun to the French rear. It became the artery of life for the defenders. Picture it: trucks, ambulances, and endless convoys rolling through mud, shell craters, and under constant threat of German fire 24/7. Without this lifeline, the fortress would have been lost quickly. Pétain insisted on rotating units every few days to prevent soldiers from breaking under constant bombardment, a rare consideration for mental health in an era when shell shock was barely understood. He also made sure men got mail, decent food, and moments of rest. Small gestures in a hellish environment, but they mattered. If you've ever seen photos or paintings of Verdun, you know it looks almost otherworldly. The battlefield became a lunar landscape. Endless craters, shattered trees, and mud that swallowed men whole. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of cordite and decay. It's hard to imagine the courage it took to stay put under such conditions, day after day, month after month, as shells fell in unrelenting waves. Yet, the French held on for nearly 10 months, turning Verdun into a symbol of national endurance and sacrifice. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Allies decided to strike back. The Somme offensive, launched in July 1916, was intended to relieve Verdun by forcing the Germans to divert troops and break through the front lines. Coordination between the British and French armies wasn't always smooth. Their approaches to warfare varied, and communication was spotty at best. Still, they agreed on a massive artillery bombardment, followed by an infantry assault, a classic, if somewhat outdated plan. The British, led by General Douglas Haig, were eager to demonstrate their strength, though many of the soldiers on the ground were fresh recruits, untested and poorly prepared for what lay ahead. The first day of the Somme is infamous, and rightly so. British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, with more than 19,000 killed. Imagine thousands of young men, many just out of training camps, stepping into no man's land, expecting the enemy to be crushed by artillery fire, only to face German machine guns and barbed wire, almost intact. Why did this happen? The artillery bombardment failed to destroy German defenses as expected. The guns ran out of shells, and many shells were duds. German soldiers, sheltered in deep bunkers, were ready and waiting. The result was devastating. Wave after wave of British infantry was cut down. This disaster shocked Britain and shook the confidence of commanders and politicians alike, but also forced a reckoning about how war was fought. Among the Somme's tragedies, a new hope appeared: the tank. These clunky, armored vehicles were designed to roll over barbed wire and crush enemy machine guns. On the battlefield, they looked like iron beasts from a science fiction story. But the reality was more sobering. Early tanks were slow, prone to mechanical failures, and vulnerable to artillery. Crews had little training, and often tanks got stuck in mud or simply broke down. Still, the psychological effect on the enemy was significant, and the Somme saw the first real glimpse of mechanized warfare's potential. The tank's debut was far from perfect, but it planted a seed for the future, a hint that technology would soon change the face of combat forever. Here's the tricky part. Both Verdun and the Somme taught harsh lessons, but many commanders failed to fully grasp them at the time. At Verdun, Pétain showed that logistics and troop rotation were critical. You can't just throw men at a problem and hope they hold. You have to manage their endurance carefully. The Somme exposed the limits of relying on artillery barges without solid infantry tactics. It was clear that new methods and technologies were desperately needed. Tanks hinted at a mechanized future, but needed years of development before becoming decisive. Yet, despite these lessons, the war dragged on. Commanders often stuck to old doctrines, repeating costly mistakes in the name of honor and duty. Verdun and the Somme aren't just names in history books. They're stark reminders of the human cost behind military strategy. The young men who marched into hell, the commanders who grappled with new realities, and the landscapes forever scarred. You know what? Even now, when we stroll through the quiet fields or visit the cemeteries, those battles whisper their lessons about endurance, leadership, and the price of stubbornness. And maybe, just maybe, they remind us why we should never forget what war truly means. Imagine the British Royal Navy as a massive steel gatekeeper controlling the flow of the world's commerce. At the start of World War I, Britain had the largest navy on the planet, a true maritime powerhouse. Their plan? Starve Germany of everything it needed to keep fighting. This naval blockade wasn't just a casual warning. It was a full-scale stranglehold. Britain patrolled the North Sea and beyond, intercepting merchant ships and cutting off nearly all sea trade to Germany. The goal was to prevent food, fuel, raw materials, and weapons from reaching German ports. Unlike land battles that flashed and flared, the blockade was a slow, grinding pressure, like tightening a noose around the enemy's neck. What made this so brutal was its impact on civilians. German cities faced food shortages, and basic goods became scarce and expensive. Starvation edged closer to reality for many, with malnutrition and hardship rippling through the population. Factories struggled without imported materials, slowing down war production. The blockade chipped away at Germany's home front morale and industrial strength in a way that guns and trenches couldn't easily achieve. Germany protested, but with Britain's naval dominance, breaking the blockade was next to impossible, at least on the surface. The blockade set the stage for the next desperate gambit, Germany's undersea warfare. Since Britain's navy dominated the seas, Germany needed a game-changer. Enter the U-boat, short for undersea boat or undersea boat. These submarines were stealthy, hard to detect, and deadly silent killers lurking beneath the waves. But why submarines? Surface battleships and cruisers simply couldn't match the Royal Navy's numbers and firepower. Submarines, however, could strike unexpectedly, swooping in to sink enemy ships without warning. For Germany, U-boats were the perfect weapon to counter British naval supremacy. But here's the twist. Early in the war, international law required submarines to surface and give warning before sinking merchant vessels, giving crews time to evacuate. Germany, desperate to tighten the blockade, abandoned this gentleman's rule and declared unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning they would sink any ship, military or civilian, without warning if it was headed to Allied ports. This was a controversial and risky decision. Militarily, it could starve Britain into submission faster. Morally, it sparked outrage, especially when neutral or passenger ships were hit. Within Germany, debates raged. Was this tactic justifiable or a reckless provocation? The answer wasn't clear-cut, but Germany pressed on. The U-boats transformed naval warfare into a shadowy, invisible threat. Merchant ships were no longer safe anywhere. The ocean became a deadly game of hide-and-seek with an unseen hunter, forever changing the nature of war. If you had to pick one moment that changed public perception of the war, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania might be it. On May 7, 1915, this luxury British ocean liner was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Ireland. The tragedy was swift and horrific. The ship sank in just 18 minutes, taking 1,198 lives, including 128 Americans. The fact that a civilian passenger ship was targeted and so many innocent lives lost sent shockwaves around the world. This incident quickly morphed into a massive propaganda weapon for the Allies. Newspapers splashed headlines about German barbarism and unprovoked attacks. Public opinion, especially in the United States, which was still officially neutral, began shifting. Suddenly, the war wasn't a far-off European quarrel. It felt immediate and personal. You might wonder why Germany even targeted the Lusitania, given it was a passenger ship. Well, the ship was also carrying munitions, which complicated the issue. But for many, the fine print didn't matter. The sinking became a symbol of innocent civilians caught in the crossfire, and it ultimately nudged the U.S. closer to entering the war. By 1916, both Britain and Germany knew that sea power could decide the war. So they sent their fleets into one of the largest naval battles ever, the Battle of Jutland. Imagine over 250 warships clashing across the cold North Sea, thousands of sailors fighting amid thick smoke, roaring guns, and exploding shells. The British Grand Fleet, with its massive dreadnought battleships, faced off against Germany's high seas fleet in a dramatic and deadly dance. But here's the kicker. Despite heavy losses on both sides, British ships sunk, thousands dead. The battle ended inconclusively. Germany inflicted more damage but failed to break Britain's naval blockade. Britain, though bloodied, still controlled the seas. Why so unclear? Well, Jutland showed that naval warfare wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about strategic positioning and psychological advantage. Britain's fleet remained a looming threat, forcing Germany's navy to retreat and play defense for the rest of the war. So, was Jutland a victory or a defeat? It's complicated. It was a tactical win for Germany, but a strategic win for Britain. Both sides walked away with bruised egos and hard lessons. By 1917, German U-boats were wreaking havoc on Allied shipping. Merchant ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Losses mounted, and it seemed like Britain might run out of supplies. Enter the convoy system, a simple but brilliant solution. Instead of sailing alone, vulnerable merchant vessels traveled in groups escorted by warships. This method vastly reduced the U-boat's ability to pick off easy targets. The convoy system wasn't without challenges. It required careful coordination, trust among crews, and brave escorts willing to face lurking dangers. But as convoys became the norm, U-boat success rates plummeted. This teamwork, combined with improved sonar and air patrols, turned the tide. The seas slowly became less deadly for Allied shipping. The convoys were a reminder that sometimes sticking together is the best defense, even when the enemy is invisible. Naval warfare in World War I wasn't just a sideshow. It was central to the conflict's outcome. The British blockades' pressure weakened Germany internally, limiting its ability to wage war effectively. The U-boat campaign forced new military thinking, diplomacy, and even changed public opinion globally. Moreover, the war at sea forced technological innovations, better sonar, depth charges, convoy tactics that shaped future conflicts. It also highlighted the blurred lines between military and civilian targets, foreshadowing the total wars of the 20th century. Behind all the steel and strategy were real people, sailors, merchant mariners, and families affected by hunger and loss. The oceans may seem vast and impersonal, but the war at sea proved that human courage and suffering are woven into every wave. When the First World War erupted in 1914, most of the world's attention and history books focused on the blood-soaked trenches of Europe. But the truth is, the war's ripples reached far beyond the muddy fields of France and Belgium. Thousands upon thousands of men from colonies across Africa, Asia, and Oceania were swept into the global conflict, fighting battles as brutal and defining as those on the Western Front. Their stories are often buried beneath the grand narratives of empires, but they're essential if we want to understand the full scope of this truly global war. Let's pause for a moment and imagine the vast diversity of the men who signed up or were signed up for battle. These weren't just faceless colonial troops. They were farmers, shopkeepers, students, elders, and dreamers pulled from lives worlds apart from the European fronts. Recruitment wasn't a uniform process. Sometimes it was voluntary, fueled by a complex mix of loyalty, hope, and the promise of steady pay. In other cases, coercion or social pressure played a big role. Take West Africa, for instance. Village chiefs, often allied with colonial powers, sometimes encouraged or insisted that young men join the ranks, viewing military service as a way to gain status or protect their communities in a time of upheaval. For many, enlistment was an escape from grinding poverty or a route to adventure and travel, the kind of experiences they'd never had before. But for some, it was far less glamorous, forced conscription or the bitter choice between starvation and a uniform. This mix of motivations created a patchwork army. The daily reality? Men who had never even held a rifle were suddenly thrust into the most mechanized and deadly war the world had seen, carrying with them not just their weapons, but entire cultures and stories. While Europe wrestled in trenches and artillery barges, the African continent became a sprawling theater of war few remember. Germany's African colonies, Togoland, Cameroon, German East Africa, became hotly contested battlegrounds where colonial powers fought to seize and hold territory. These campaigns were nothing like the static, muddy trench warfare of the Western Front. Instead, they were marked by rapid, grueling movement through dense jungles, sweltering savannas, and rugged mountains. Tropical diseases like malaria and dysentery were as lethal as bullets. African soldiers, often recruited from local ethnic groups or neighboring colonies, became the backbone of these forces. Their intimate knowledge of the terrain and climate made them invaluable. Under commanders like Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, the German general famed for his guerrilla tactics, the East African campaign turned into a years-long chase through some of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Von Lettow-Vorbeck's forces, though vastly outnumbered, managed to tie down thousands of Allied troops simply by staying mobile and striking unexpectedly. The African soldiers who fought in these campaigns endured harsh conditions, starvation, exhaustion, disease, yet their resilience was remarkable. But here's the kicker. Despite their sacrifices, many African soldiers returned to little recognition, caught between colonial neglect and the fading promises of empire. Shift your gaze to the Anzac troops, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and Indian soldiers, and you find stories of raw grit, pride, and complex legacies. The Anzacs are forever linked with Gallipoli, a campaign intended as a swift strike against Ottoman forces, but which instead became a nightmare of mud, heat, and staggering losses. The beaches of Gallipoli saw young men who had never been far from home thrown into a war that tested every ounce of courage and endurance they had. For Australia and New Zealand, Gallipoli became a defining moment, forging a national identity out of sacrifice and shared hardship. Meanwhile, Indian soldiers numbered over 1 million across the war. Their footprint was enormous and widespread, from the freezing trenches of France to the blistering deserts of Mesopotamia. This wasn't a homogeneous group either. Sikhs with their turbans and swords, Gurkhas with their kukris, Muslim, Hindu, and Christian soldiers all fought side by side. Indian troops faced harsh conditions, cultural challenges, and a military hierarchy that often saw them as second class. Yet, they fought fiercely, driven by a mixture of loyalty to the empire, hopes for political reform back home, and a desire to prove their valor on the world stage. Sadly, post-war promises of political rights and reforms rarely materialized, leaving many feeling betrayed. Ask most people about the Arab Revolt, and the name T. Lawrence of Arabia, likely springs to mind. His image, complete with flowing robes and daring desert raids, has become legend. But peel back the layers, and you find a story that's far more nuanced and complicated. The Arab Revolt was more than a British-backed rebellion. It was a genuine uprising by Arab tribes yearning to break free from Ottoman rule. Lawrence's role? Part military advisor, part diplomat, part mythmaker. He helped coordinate guerrilla attacks on Ottoman supply lines, inspiring tribes to unite around the hope of independence. But here's the thing. The promises made to Arab leaders were vague, often contradictory, and ultimately undercut by British and French imperial ambitions at war's end. The cultural gap between British officers and Arab fighters was vast, leading to misunderstandings and tensions. Still, the revolt left an indelible mark on the Middle East, shaping the borders, politics, and conflicts for decades to come. Imagine the chaos and camaraderie of soldiers from wildly different cultures suddenly thrown together in the same trenches or camps. The day-to-day life of colonial armies was a mosaic of languages, religions, and customs rubbing up against each other. Have you ever opened your pantry only to find it emptier than expected? Now imagine that feeling stretched across entire cities, towns, and farms. Food shortages weren't some minor inconvenience. They cut deep into daily life and family rituals. The staples people took for granted, meat, sugar, butter, even coffee, became scarce treasures. Governments rolled out rationing systems to manage these shortages. Everyone got coupons or ration books, carefully calculated to spread resources fairly. But fairness, as it turned out, was tricky. Some families got creative, inventing recipes from scraps or stretching tiny amounts of ingredients into full meals. Housewives swapped tips in hushed tones about how to make mock versions of meat or desserts that didn't require sugar. Sometimes it felt like a never-ending cooking challenge, where the prize was just feeding the family. And of course, not everyone played by the rules. Black markets thrived quietly, and coupon trading became a small underground economy. People hoarded, bartered, or just plain ignored restrictions when they could. It was a time of small rebellions in kitchens and markets. Acts that said, "We're surviving, come what may." Walk down any city street during wartime, and you'd see walls plastered with eye-catching posters, vivid reds, blues, and yellows shouting slogans like "Keep calm" and "Carry on," "We can do it," or "Your country needs you." These weren't just decoration. They were psychological lifelines designed to stir pride, rally effort, and keep spirits from sagging. But posters were only part of the picture. Film, which was booming in popularity, became a powerful tool. Movies weren't just entertainment, they were morale machines. Scenes of heroism, sacrifice, and triumph flickered across screens, shaping public mood and reminding everyone what they were fighting for. Interestingly, as the war dragged on, propaganda softened its tone. Early on, it screamed courage and swift victory. Later, it whispered endurance and patience. It felt like someone telling you, "Hang in there," when your feet are blistered and the road feels endless. That subtle shift in messaging mirrored the emotional roller coaster of the home front, where hope and exhaustion lived side by side. While propaganda shouted, censorship whispered, sometimes so quietly it was nearly invisible. Governments faced a delicate balancing act. Keep the public informed, but not alarmed. Share enough news to maintain trust, but not so much that morale tanked or military secrets leaked. That meant newspapers, radio broadcasts, and letters home were carefully screened. Some stories were buried. Disasters, losses, or dissenting opinions didn't make the headlines. The truth became a slippery thing, bent to serve national interest. For many, this led to confusion or outright suspicion. People wanted facts, but felt like they were getting a filtered, sanitized version of reality. Imagine living with that uncertainty, where you had to guess what was real and what was official. Trust in the press became a tightrope walk, with many leaning into rumors or private conversations to fill the gaps left by silence. It's a reminder that sometimes the loudest battles aren't fought with guns, but with words. Here's the kicker. You might think that patriotism would keep everyone united through thick and thin. But even the most loyal citizens have limits. As rations tightened, jobs became harder, and the worry for absent loved ones grew, people started pushing back. Factories faced strikes, sometimes over pay or working conditions. Streets saw protests, not always violent, but charged with frustration. War weariness crept in like an unwelcome guest, turning cheers into sighs. Governments tried hard to keep control, balancing crackdowns with concessions, but often it was a messy business. This wasn't about disloyalty, it was about real human limits. People wanted to support the war, but also needed to survive it. It's a reminder that the home front was a battlefield in its own right, one where patience, endurance, and sometimes outright defiance played crucial roles. Looking back, the home front was a tangled tapestry of contradictions. Pride and pressure, hope and hardship, truth and silence. Women shattered old roles, families stretched their meals thin, governments shaped what people saw and heard, and ordinary folks pushed back when the strain got too heavy. These stories matter because war isn't just fought in distant lands. It's fought in the hearts and homes of people living it day by day. And sometimes that struggle, the quiet resilience, the small rebellions, the cracks in the system, shapes the world long after the last gunfire fades. So next time you think of war, remember the home front, the unsung, unseen, and utterly human story behind every headline. By 1917, World War I had dragged on for what seemed like forever. Picture this. Millions of men stuck in muddy trenches stretching across miles of blasted, scarred land. The same blasted land littered with shattered trees, barbed wire, and the echoes of gunfire. For years, Europe's major powers had been caught in a grinding stalemate. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage, and the toll was horrendous. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, America watched with a mixture of concern, curiosity, and hesitation. The U.S. had pledged neutrality, hoping to avoid the tangled web of alliances and bloodshed that had swallowed much of the world. For many, the war felt distant, an ugly European quarrel that America was smart to avoid. Yet beneath the surface, cracks were forming. The war was bleeding Europe dry, reshaping economies, societies, and politics in ways no one had predicted. So what pushed America from cautious observer to active combatant? It wasn't just one event, but a complex stew of provocations, ideals, and practical realities coming to a boil. The story of 1917 is a story of secrets, risks, and speeches, a year when the American dream collided head-on with the brutal realities of modern war. Let's rewind to January 1917. Imagine British spies hunched over telegraph wires in London, intercepting coded messages passing across the ocean. One message stands out from German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, addressed to the German ambassador in Mexico. The telegram proposed a deal. If Mexico entered the war on Germany's side, Germany promised to help Mexico reclaim the American Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Sounds wild, right? Like something from a James Bond novel. But this wasn't fiction. It was a real, clandestine attempt to destabilize America from within. Germany hoped that by distracting the U.S. with a conflict closer to home, it could keep America out of the European war. When the British handed the decoded telegram to the U.S. government, the reaction was explosive. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages. Americans who had been content to sit on the sidelines felt a sudden jolt of alarm and anger. How dare a foreign power plot against their homeland so brazenly? But here's the irony. Germany thought this secret message would strengthen its position. Instead, it helped break the back of American neutrality. Mexico, embroiled in its own revolution and instability, quickly dismissed the offer. Meanwhile, American citizens and politicians alike began pushing for action, seeing the telegram as a clear threat to national security. You know what's fascinating? This episode shows how diplomacy, espionage, and media combined to shift public opinion rapidly. The Zimmermann telegram wasn't just a message. It was a catalyst that turned simmering concerns into a call to arms. As if the Zimmermann telegram wasn't enough to get American blood boiling, Germany's submarine campaign added fuel to the fire. During the war's early years, Germany had mostly targeted military vessels, trying to choke off supplies to the Allies. But by 1917, things escalated dramatically. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning their U-boats would torpedo any ships sailing into designated war zones, civilian, neutral, and military alike. The policy was ruthless but strategic. Germany's hope? Starve Britain, block vital resources, and force a surrender before the U.S. could fully gear up for war. You might recall the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, a British passenger ship torpedoed by a German submarine, killing over 1,000 civilians, including 128 Americans. That tragedy already shook the American public, sparking outrage and calls for justice. But Germany had restrained its submarine campaign after that, fearing American retaliation. Now, they threw caution to the wind. The result was chaos. Merchant ships vanished beneath the waves. Families lost breadwinners. Insurance rates soared. The Atlantic Ocean became a perilous gauntlet. From Germany's perspective, it was a calculated risk, one they hoped would pay off before America's industrial and military might could tip the balance. But it backfired spectacularly. Americans, many of whom had hoped to remain neutral, felt personally attacked. The war was no longer some distant European problem. It was now a direct threat to American lives and livelihoods. Interestingly, this policy also exposed the limits of military power when weighed against public opinion. No matter how strategic, Attacks on civilian life tend to rally those targeted rather than cow them into submission. Germany underestimated that deeply. By early April 1917, the drumbeat for war had grown deafening. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on keeping America out of the conflict, found himself standing at a historic crossroads. On April 2nd, he addressed a joint session of Congress with a speech that would reverberate across the century. The world must be made safe for democracy. This phrase wasn't just rhetoric. It was a carefully crafted moral frame that redefined America's role in the conflict. Wilson cast the war not as a fight for territory or revenge, but as a battle between democracy and autocracy, freedom and oppression. It was a powerful message, especially at a time when many Americans felt weary of war talk, but also alarmed by the global chaos unfolding. Wilson's vision gave the war a higher purpose, something noble to rally around. Yet, the speech also glossed over the brutal realities soldiers would face in the trenches. War, after all, is rarely clean or heroic in practice. It's muddy, chaotic, and unforgiving. Wilson's idealism had to contend with that grim truth. Still, his words transformed public opinion. Isolationist voices softened. Volunteers signed up. The country began to mobilize with renewed energy and urgency. And let's be honest, the idea of fighting for democracy struck a chord then and has continued to do so ever since. It's a phrase politicians return to again and again, sometimes wielded with genuine conviction, other times with a bit more political theater. But in 1917, it was the spark that lit the fire. Declaring war is one thing. Fighting it is another. Once America was officially in, the real work began, building an army capable of facing the horrors of trench warfare. The U.S. had a small standing army at the time, mostly geared toward peacetime needs. Scaling up meant recruiting, training, and equipping millions of men, many of whom had never held a rifle. Training camps mushroomed across the country, from the heat of Camp Travis in Texas to the rolling hills of Camp Lewis in Washington. These places were a mix of excitement and frustration. Imagine thousands of young men from all walks of life suddenly thrust into rigid routines, learning to march, shoot, and survive. Some found the camaraderie energizing, others found the drills grueling. But the challenges went deeper than the human element. America's factories, though powerful, were not yet fully adapted to the demands of mass-producing modern weapons and gear. There were shortages of rifles, boots, helmets, and even basic supplies. Logistics became a giant headache, moving equipment across the vast country, then shipping it safely overseas through U-boat-infested waters. You can almost picture the scene. Factory floors buzzing with activity, women stepping into roles previously held by men, and a nation shifting gears at breakneck speed. It was a massive collective effort, blending industry, government, and individual sacrifice. And out of this chaos, a new identity formed. The term doughboy came to symbolize the American infantryman, fresh-faced, determined, and untested. Some say the nickname came from the white dust covering soldiers' uniforms in training camps. Others point to dough-like buttons on their uniforms. Regardless, the doughboys became a symbol of hope and raw energy. By mid-1917, the first American troops, the doughboys, began arriving on French soil. To the exhausted Allied soldiers who had been fighting for years, this was a welcome sight. Fresh troops meant fresh hope, a new lease on the war. But it wasn't all glory. The Americans had to learn fast. The trenches were unlike anything they'd imagined. Endless mud, rat infestations, constant shelling, and the ever-present threat of gas attacks. Many doughboys faced a steep learning curve as they adapted from training camp routines to the chaos of frontline combat. Still, their arrival sent a powerful message. Germany now had to reckon with a new, formidable opponent. The psychological boost for the Allies was immense. No longer were they isolated, fighting alone against the Central Powers. Behind the headlines, personal stories added texture to the war. Letters home described moments of fear, laughter, friendship, and loss. Soldiers wrote about their first snow in the trenches, the camaraderie formed over shared rations, and the haunting silence after an artillery barrage. This human side reminds us that war isn't just strategy and statistics. It's made up of individual lives, hopes, and sacrifices. So what does it all add up to? Why do historians point to 1917 as the real turning point? Because America's entry changed the game. It wasn't just fresh troops or resources. It was a signal that the old world order was shifting. The stalemate was breaking. The balance of power was tilting. Yet, it also introduced new complexities. America's presence made the war longer and bloodier in some ways. It challenged ideals, tested endurance, and forced tough decisions at home and abroad. But above all, 1917 marked a transformation. A nation that once stood aloof had stepped onto the world stage, carrying the weight of ideals and realities, hopes and fears, victory and loss. And that year set the stage for the century to come. A century shaped by American influence, global conflict, and the enduring quest to make the world safe for democracy. By early 1917, Russia felt like a giant teetering on a shaky foundation, just waiting for the right shove to send it crashing down. Imagine the scene. The streets of Petrograd cloaked in a gray, biting cold, with crowds lining up for food that barely exists. The war had stretched the empire's resources so thin that everyday life was a struggle for survival. People weren't just hungry for bread. They were hungry for change, for hope, for something to believe in. The old order, the centuries-old Romanov dynasty under Tsar Nicholas II, had long seemed unshakable, almost eternal. But beneath the surface, everything was crumbling. The economic pressures of the Great War, combined with social unrest and political stagnation, had turned the Grand Empire into a powder keg. And when that powder keg finally ignited, it didn't just rock the political landscape. It shattered the very idea of Imperial Russia. You know what's fascinating here? This story isn't just about armies and battles fought far from the front lines. It's about real people, workers, peasants, mothers, soldiers, whose daily lives were marked by cold nights, empty stomachs, and growing frustration. The ground was shifting beneath their feet, and with every passing day, the cracks grew wider until the whole structure gave way. So how exactly did this empire break? What made the people snap? And how did a centuries-old monarchy disappear almost overnight? Let's take a closer look at the chaotic, emotional, and deeply human story behind Russia's breaking point. Here's the thing about war. It's not just soldiers fighting on the front lines. There's a whole home front, a country's heartbeat, that gets caught in the crossfire too. And in Russia's case, it was crushing. By 1917, the Russian economy was a mess. Factories that used to churn out goods were either running way behind or completely shut down. Raw materials were scarce, workers were exhausted, and inflation was spiraling out of control. Imagine getting paid less and less in real terms while prices for the simplest things, like bread, potatoes, even coal, kept shooting up. Life in the cities was a constant struggle to keep the lights on and the stomachs full. And bread, oh bread, that simple, everyday staple became a symbol of survival itself. But the war had disrupted farming and transportation so badly that bread supplies were unreliable, at best. People lined up for hours, sometimes days, hoping to grab a loaf before the shelves ran dry. When the bread didn't come, frustration turned to anger. Food shortages weren't just about hunger. They were about dignity, about the feeling that the government didn't care. That anger exploded into bread riots. It started with murmurs, whispers among hungry crowds, mostly women, who bore the brunt of feeding families when men were off fighting. Textile workers in Petrograd were some of the first to strike, sending ripples through the city. The streets filled with shouting, with banners, with chants demanding bread and down with the Tsar. The air was thick with tension, fear, and something fierce, raw desperation. You could almost feel the energy crackling in the cold air. The mix of dust, sweat, and anger that no one could ignore. Soldiers were caught in the middle, often reluctant to fire on their own people. It wasn't just a food crisis, it was a social and political powder keg, ready to blow. It's funny how history repeats itself, isn't it? Bread shortages toppled the French monarchy in 1789, sparking a revolution that changed the world. Russia was following a similar, heartbreaking script. When people lose hope of even the basics, when their very survival feels threatened, that's when the ground beneath any regime starts to crumble. So the bread riots weren't just about missing food on the table. They were about a breaking point, a loud, angry roar from a people who felt forgotten, starved, and desperate for change. So, the bread riots were just the beginning, the spark that set off a fire nobody could control. What started as hunger quickly became a full-blown political earthquake. It all came to a head in February 1917, when Petrograd streets swelled with protesters who weren't just demanding bread anymore. They were demanding the impossible, an end to a system that had failed them. The protest was sparked, ironically enough, by women. Women textile workers went on strike, fed up with long hours, starvation wages, and the endless war that tore their families apart. Their courage was contagious. Soon, thousands of workers, students, and soldiers flooded the streets. Shops closed, factories halted. It was a city paralyzed by anger and hope. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, was miles away, both physically at the front and mentally trapped in outdated beliefs. He clung stubbornly to the idea of divine right, convinced his authority was unbreakable. When he heard about the unrest, his response was classic autocracy: send in the troops and crush it. But here's the twist: those troops were just as fed up as the protesters. Many refused to fire on civilians. Some even switched sides, joining the crowds. Imagine that moment: soldiers turning their rifles away from their commanders, walking into the sea of protesters. It was the ultimate sign that the old regime's grip was slipping. Under this mounting pressure, Nicholas had no choice but to abdicate, giving up the throne that his family had held for over 300 years. An empire that seemed eternal vanished overnight, replaced by uncertainty and chaos. But could anyone have held it together at that point? With hunger gnawing at the people, war bleeding the country dry, and the very soldiers meant to defend the Tsar now standing with the protesters, it was like trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. The February Revolution wasn't just a political shift, it was a profound social rupture. It was the moment when the ground literally gave way beneath Imperial Russia, and something new, unpredictable, began to emerge. So, with the Tsar out of the picture, you might think things would calm down, right? Well, not exactly. Russia was like a car with no driver, barreling down a cliff. Enter the provisional government, the folks who stepped in to try and steer that chaos towards something resembling order. This government was a strange mix: liberals who wanted democracy, moderate socialists dreaming of reform, and some old-school elites who hoped to hold on to what power they could. Their biggest promise? To keep Russia fighting in World War I alongside the Allies. And honestly, that was a massive blunder. Why? Because the war was deeply unpopular. Soldiers were exhausted, morale was tanking, and the families back home just wanted the fighting to stop. Imagine being told, hey, hang in there, keep bleeding for the war effort, when your belly's empty and your neighbors are dying. The provisional government's insistence on continuing the war effort was like pouring gasoline on a fire that was already raging. It made them look out of touch, unwilling, or unable to grasp how desperate the people had become. Meanwhile, the power dynamic was slipping away from them. Around the same time, the Soviets, councils made up of workers, soldiers, and peasants, were gaining traction. They promised real change, real power to the people. Suddenly, you had two governments in the same country, pulling in opposite directions. Caught in the middle, the provisional government struggled to govern. Their reforms were too little, too late. Their grip on the military weakened as soldiers deserted or sided with the Soviets. They were trapped between demands for peace and pressure to maintain the war. You know what? It was a no-win situation. So while the provisional government tried to hold the line, it was clear the old ways were crumbling fast. Their stopgap was just that, a temporary patch on a sinking ship. By the fall of 1917, Russia was like a stage set for a grand drama, and the Bolsheviks were ready for their curtain call. Lenin and his crew had been watching the chaos unfold, waiting patiently for their moment to pounce. Their message? Peace, land, and bread. Simple words, but powerful enough to light a fire under a tired, war-weary population. The October Revolution wasn't some massive, explosive battle. It was more like a swift, strategic chess move. In a matter of days, Bolshevik forces took control of key points in Petrograd, the telegraph office, the railway stations, and the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was based. It was a takeover, but surprisingly bloodless for such a seismic shift. People on the streets had mixed feelings. Some cheered, hoping for relief from war and hunger. Others were nervous, uncertain what this radical change would really mean. Was this a new beginning or just another kind of control? Would promises of equality turn into oppression? The truth is the Bolsheviks didn't just want power. They wanted to reset Russia completely. They aimed to build a society where workers and peasants ruled, where the old aristocracy and bourgeoisie were swept aside. It was a total break from the past. You know what's wild? In the middle of all this turmoil, everyday people had to keep living, finding food, caring for family, wondering what tomorrow might bring. For many, hope and fear lived side by side, tangled up like the city's smoky winter skies. So the October Revolution was more than a political coup. It was a promise of peace and land wrapped in a vision for a radically different future. But, as with all promises, the real story was yet to unfold. One of the very first and most shocking moves the Bolsheviks made after taking power was to end Russia's involvement in World War I. For a country exhausted and starving, peace wasn't just a wish, it was a desperate necessity. So in early 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, and the price was staggering. Imagine handing over a huge chunk of your backyard. And by backyard, I mean about a third of your entire empire. Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic states, parts of Belarus, and Finland all slipped from Russia's grasp overnight. It was like cutting off a massive piece of yourself, and the world watched in stunned silence. For many Russians, the treaty was a bitter pill to swallow. Sure, the guns finally went quiet, but at the cost of humiliation and massive territorial loss. It wasn't just land. It was resources, population, and prestige, all gone in one sweeping agreement. Yet, the Bolsheviks saw it as a painful but necessary step. Their priority was clear: consolidate power at home, focus on building their revolution, and avoid the ruinous costs of continuing a war they couldn't win. Peace came at a price, yes, but it was a price they were willing to pay. It's interesting to think about how treaties like Brest-Litovsk echo through history. The Treaty of Versailles a couple of years later would also redraw maps and fuel resentments that set the stage for future conflicts. History seems to have a knack for harsh deals that shake the world to its core. So, the treaty was more than just a ceasefire. It was a turning point that reshaped Russia's borders and its future. The peace bought with such sacrifice was fragile, and the scars it left would run deep. Looking back, 1917 wasn't just a year, it was a rupture. An earthquake that split Russia apart socially, politically, and emotionally. The old empire, with all its traditions and hierarchies, collapsed beneath the weight of hunger, war, and unmet demands for justice. But from that broken ground, something new, messy, raw, and uncertain began to take shape. The promise of peace, land, and bread sparked hope in millions, but that hope was fragile. What followed was far from easy. Civil war, famine, repression, and rebuilding on a scale nobody had ever attempted. Russia's story was no longer one of an empire, but of a revolution seeking to redefine society from the ground up. You know what's striking? The human element throughout this turmoil. The workers lining up in freezing streets, the soldiers torn between loyalty and survival, the families clinging to faith amidst chaos. The breaking of Russia was as much about their courage and despair as it was about politics. And here's a thought. Sometimes, before you can build something new and lasting, you have to let the old fall apart. Breaking isn't the end. It's often the beginning of a journey, one filled with uncertainty but also possibility. Russia's fracture in 1917 still echoes today, reminding us how quickly everything we know can shift and how people's resilience shapes the future. The empire may have broken, but the story of its people, their struggles, and their hopes carried on. If you think about World War I, the image that usually pops up is endless mud, barbed wire, and soldiers slogging through trenches while bullets whiz overhead. But beneath that grim surface was a quieter revolution, a revolution in technology that shook the entire battlefield to its core. It's wild to imagine how quickly things changed during those years, right? One moment, armies clung to century-old tactics. The next, they were thrust into a new era where machines, tanks, planes, artillery, and yes, even gas began dictating the pace and the pain of war. Let me tell you, it wasn't smooth sailing. Many of these new tools were rough around the edges, unreliable, or downright terrifying for the people using or facing them. But over time, they shifted the balance of power, rewriting the rules of engagement in ways no one fully expected. So buckle up. We're taking a closer look at how technology reshaped the Great War, piece by piece. Picture this. It's 1916. The battlefield is a nightmare of craters, mud, and machine gun fire. Suddenly, out of the mist rumbles a strange, armored beast. Not a horse, not a man, but a tank. The tank was a bit of an oddball at first. Slow, clunky, and prone to breaking down, these massive machines weren't exactly sleek warhorses. But you know what? They were a game changer just by existing. They shattered the psychological wall of trench warfare. Those metal monsters could roll over barbed wire and withstand bullets that would tear a soldier apart. For many troops, seeing a tank meant either hope or horror. The British Mark I tank, the Pioneer, was basically a giant armored caterpillar with guns poking out the sides. Not fast, maxing out around 3 to 4 miles per hour, but it pushed forward where infantry couldn't. By 1917 and 1918, mass production kicked in. Factories churned out tanks in larger numbers, making them more than just rare curiosities. But here's the thing. Early tanks were mechanical nightmares. Engines overheated, tracks broke, and drivers faced blistering heat inside cramped steel boxes. Still, their presence forced commanders to rethink how they attacked. Tanks helped break through the deadly stalemate of trenches, even if it was often inch-by-inch progress. Soldiers who rode these beasts told stories of deafening noise, terrifying rattles, and moments of sheer panic when the tank stalled or caught fire. And the enemy? Well, tank crews became prime targets. Anti-tank rifles and artillery soon evolved in response. But the idea had taken root. War was no longer just about men with rifles and horses. By the end of World War I, tank warfare was becoming a real thing. A sneak peek of the blitzkrieg style that would dominate decades later. Those hulking machines hinted at a future where mechanized power could tip the scales in battle. Now let's look up, literally. The skies above World War I were turning into their own battleground, a strange new frontier where dogfights and daring feats changed the nature of war. At the start, planes were mostly for reconnaissance, spying on enemy troop movements and artillery positions. But it didn't take long before pilots started shooting at each other. The big breakthrough? Synchronization gear. This clever tech allowed machine guns to fire right through the spinning propeller blades without tearing them apart. Suddenly, planes weren't just eyes in the sky. They became deadly weapons. The British Sopwith Camel emerged as a star in this new world. It was tricky to fly, famed for its sensitivity and tendency to spin out if mishandled. But in the hands of a skilled pilot, it was a killer, agile and fast. It racked up more aerial victories than any other Allied plane. On the German side, the Fokker Eindecker was a game-changer early on, giving them a brief period of air dominance with its synchronized guns. Later, improved Fokkers and Albatros fighters kept the competition fierce. Flying at 10,000 feet wasn't just about skill. It was about nerves, guts, and a dash of luck. The romantic notion of knights of the air Battling it out above the mud was part myth, part reality. The truth? It was brutally dangerous. Pilots faced freezing cold, thin air, and the constant threat of a fiery death. Parachutes weren't common early on, and planes were fragile. Still, air combat had a massive impact. Controlling the skies meant better intel, safer artillery targeting, and even bombing raids on enemy supply lines. The psychological boost of seeing your own planes overhead, or the crushing fear of enemy fighters, was immense. And let's be honest, these aerial duels captured imaginations back home, shaping how people thought about war, heroism, and technology for decades to come. If tanks and planes grabbed headlines, artillery was the real workhorse of World War I battles, and its marriage with infantry tactics was key to shifting the balance. Before the war, artillery was often an independent beast, pounding away with little coordination. Infantry would just wait, sometimes helplessly, as shells flew overhead or hoped a barrage would soften defenses. But World War I forced a rethink. Artillery and infantry had to move as one, like a well-choreographed dance. Enter the creeping barrage, a slow-moving wall of shell fire that pushed forward just ahead of the attacking soldiers. Timing was everything. If the barrage moved too fast, troops would get caught in their own artillery fire. Too slow, and the enemy could recover and shoot back. Communication was a huge challenge. Radios were primitive, telephones often cut by shell fire, and runners faced deadly ground just to deliver messages. Still, gradual improvements meant artillery could better support infantry pushes, blowing up barbed wire and enemy machine gun nests at just the right moment. Soldiers remember those moments with a mix of relief and terror. The roar of artillery was both a shield and a signal. The barrage was your green light, but it also meant you were charging into a living nightmare. Between the booming shells and the screams from no man's land, every advance was a fight against fear itself. Some battles showed how this improved coordination saved lives and gained ground, even if painfully slow. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge step from earlier tactics where infantry often charged blind. If you think World War I wasn't brutal enough already, chemical weapons added a whole new layer of horror. Introduced in 1915, poison gas attacks shocked soldiers and civilians alike. Chlorine gas was the first to be unleashed, an invisible, choking cloud that caused panic and suffocation. Later came phosgene, which was deadlier but less obvious, and mustard gas, which caused agonizing burns and blindness. The psychological impact? Enormous. You never knew when or where gas might strike, so fear of the invisible enemy was constant. Yet, chemical weapons quickly lost their surprise. Gas masks and protective gear became standard issue, turning what was once terrifying into just another hazard to endure. Soldiers learned to sniff of the smell of gas and put on masks in seconds. This cat-and-mouse game of offense and defense changed the nature of warfare again. Chemical weapons weren't decisive in winning battles, but they added a cruel and unpredictable element, one that blurred lines about what was acceptable in war. On a personal level, stories from the trenches tell of gas attacks causing panic, blindness, and long-term suffering. The emotional toll was staggering. Men terrified of the unseen and struggling with injuries that had no easy cure. Despite all this, chemical weapons remained a grim footnote in a war defined by bullets and shells. They opened the door to new kinds of suffering, but ultimately didn't replace conventional arms. So, what happens when you throw all these technologies together? Tanks that could punch through defenses, planes ruling the skies, artillery firing coordinated barges, and gas adding chaos? You get a messy, evolving battlefield that was part science experiment, part brutal proving ground. No one had the perfect playbook. Generals and soldiers learned by trial, error, and often tragic mistakes. But the result was a shift from static, endless trench warfare to something more mobile and integrated. This combination laid the foundation for what we now call combined arms warfare. It was the seed for WWI's lightning-fast tank attacks supported by planes and artillery, and even modern warfare's complex coordination. Of course, Technology brought new dangers too. It saved lives by breaking stalemates, but created fresh horrors. Mechanized slaughter on an unprecedented scale. Through it all, soldiers showed remarkable resilience. Adapting to noisy, dangerous machines in the mud and blood wasn't easy. But human courage and grit persisted, even as the tools of war changed faster than anyone expected. The tech shifts of World War I were just the opening act in a century of mechanized, high-tech warfare. Tanks, planes, artillery, and gas didn't just change one war. They set the stage for everything that followed. Machines made war more deadly, no doubt. But they also made it more complex, demanding new strategies and new ways to cope. Here's a question to leave you with. When technology reshapes the battlefield so drastically, who's really in control? The people wielding the machines or the machines themselves? It's a question that echoes through history and one we're still figuring out today. You know that sinking feeling when you're backed into a corner and the only way out is to throw everything you've got at the problem? That's exactly where Germany found itself in early 1918. The Great War had dragged on far longer than anyone imagined. Europe was battered, exhausted, and the Germans in particular were clinging to the edge of collapse. For the German High Command, the Spring Offensive wasn't just another military maneuver. It was a desperate, all-in gamble, a bold and brutal attempt to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And for a little while, it looked like it might just work. Let's rewind a bit to March 1918. Germany was on the ropes. The Eastern Front had quieted down thanks to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which knocked Russia out of the war and freed up almost 500,000 troops. That was good news on paper, but those troops were still worn out, and the Western Front was anything but welcoming. The British and French lines were still stubbornly holding, and fresh American troops were just starting to show up, like reinforcements in a marathon you're barely keeping pace with. Time was slipping through Germany's fingers. They had to act fast. Enter Operation Michael, named after the Archangel Michael. This was no coincidence. The Germans hoped this offensive would be their heavenly deliverance. The plan was straightforward but audacious. Break through the British lines in the Somme region, split the British and French forces, and capture the Channel ports. If successful, it would isolate the British Expeditionary Force and force the Allies to the negotiating table. Victory or bust. And when the attack began on March 21st, it was a shock. For years, the war had been a slow, grinding stalemate. But suddenly, the Germans unleashed a storm. Using new tactics and overwhelming artillery barges, they tore through the front lines like a hot knife through butter. The British trenches, once thought impregnable, gave way. The Germans advanced over 6 miles on the very first day, an astounding distance in trench warfare terms. You can almost hear the mix of exhilaration and disbelief among the German troops. After years of brutal trench warfare and costly battles that barely shifted the front, this breakthrough was like a flash of hope, a chance to recapture the war's momentum. But the mood was complicated. Soldiers and commanders alike felt the thrill of success, but also the weight of exhaustion. Years of relentless fighting had worn everyone down, and nobody was under any illusions about how hard it was going to be to keep this going. Now, here's where the Spring Offensive gets really fascinating. It wasn't just the scale of the attack. It was how the Germans changed the way they fought. Traditional trench warfare had been slow, attritional, and brutally costly. But the Germans brought in a new tactical innovation: stormtrooper tactics. These were small, elite groups trained to move fast and hit hard, using infiltration methods to slip past enemy strongpoints rather than trying to smash through them head-on. Picture this. Instead of a massive, lumbering wave of soldiers charging straight into machine guns and barbed wire, these stormtroopers operated like special forces. They moved in small teams, often at night or undercover, targeting weak spots, cutting communication lines, and disrupting command centers. Their goal wasn't to hold territory immediately, but to sow chaos behind enemy lines, confusing and fragmenting defenses. This was a major departure from the old mindset. It required highly trained soldiers who could think on their feet and adapt quickly, the antithesis of the mass, slow-moving assaults that had dominated earlier years. Imagine being one of those stormtroopers. You're no longer just cannon fodder. You're the sharp edge of the spear. But with that comes pressure and danger. The risk of being isolated deep behind enemy lines, the need for stealth and precision, and the burden of leading the charge in one of history's deadliest conflicts. For a brief, shining moment, these tactics worked. The speed and surprise overwhelmed the Allies. The front lines blurred. The war seemed to be moving again, fast, furious, and unpredictable. But stormtrooper tactics also exposed a big challenge. They depended on top-notch training and coordination. And Germany's army, stretched thin and running low on experienced men, couldn't sustain this level of elite performance across the board. Here's the catch. No matter how brilliant the tactics or bold the plan, war eventually comes down to something a bit less glamorous: logistics. The German advance was lightning fast, but exposed an Achilles heel: supply lines. As troops surged forward, trucks and trains struggled to keep up, and horses were pushed to their limits, moving supplies over muddy, war-torn terrain. You don't often hear much about logistics in war stories, but they're absolutely critical. Without ammunition, food, medical supplies, or reinforcements arriving on time, the best troops can't hold the ground they've gained. And the deeper the Germans pushed into enemy territory, the more stretched these supply lines became. Then there was manpower, a ticking time bomb. The war had drained Germany's pool of well-trained soldiers. The stormtrooper squads might have been elite, but the bulk of the army included many inexperienced or exhausted replacements. The fresh troops couldn't match the seasoned veterans, especially under such grueling conditions. So even as the offensive tore forward, these hidden pressures began to sap its strength. The Germans were running a sprint in a marathon, and their legs were starting to buckle. Meanwhile, the Allies were far from defeated. They regrouped quickly, pulling in fresh troops, including American reinforcements, and shoring up vulnerable spots. Their resilience was remarkable. What looked like a possible collapse turned into a stubborn stand. The rapid German advances started to lose steam. Supply problems, fatigue, and mounting casualties slowed the momentum, and that was a game changer. How close did the Germans really get to Paris? Closer than most people realize. After the initial successes of Operation Michael, follow-up offensives like Operations Georgette and Blücherjörg pushed German forces dangerously near the French capital. For the first time since the war began, Paris seemed vulnerable. Can you imagine the tension? Commanders on both sides staring at maps with clenched jaws, soldiers on the front lines hearing distant artillery echoes, and civilians in Paris holding their breath, knowing that the city's fate hung in the balance. The psychological impact was huge. For the Allies, the prospect of losing Paris was terrifying, a symbol of national pride and morale. For the Germans, it was tantalizingly close, a prize that could turn the tide of the war. But here's the thing. Despite their impressive gains, the Germans couldn't break through the final line of defense. The Allies, fueled by fresh troops and new determination, managed to hold Paris. The offensive stalled. What if Paris had fallen? Would it have forced the Allies into peace negotiations? Would Germany have won the war? It's one of history's great what-ifs. But as the saying goes, history is written by those who hold the ground, and Paris held firm. By mid-1918, the glory days of the spring offensive were fading fast. The gamble hadn't failed for lack of courage or innovation. On the contrary, it was one of the most daring and innovative campaigns of the war. But brilliance alone couldn't overcome the brutal realities of supply shortages, manpower depletion, and growing Allied strength. The German army, once surging forward with hope and energy, was now drained and vulnerable. Morale slipped, exhaustion set in, and the Allies seized the opportunity to launch their own counteroffensives. The tide was turning decisively. For Germany, the spring offensive was the last great hurrah, a desperate gamble that showcased both tactical genius and the limits of endurance. Germany's spring offensive stands as a powerful lesson about war, innovation, and desperation. It showed how rapidly tactics could evolve under pressure, how small, elite units could change the face of battle, and how speed and surprise could temporarily break stalemates. But it also revealed a harsh truth. No plan, no matter how brilliant, can succeed without the backing of logistics, manpower, and time. And at the heart of this story were millions of soldiers, some stormtroopers risking everything to break the line, others exhausted foot soldiers to try to hold the ground, all caught in a maelstrom bigger than themselves. So when you think about World War I, with its mud and trenches and seemingly endless bloodshed, remember this brief moment when the war seemed to burst alive again, when Germany gambled everything, came close to victory, and ultimately found the cost was too high. It's a story of hope and heartbreak, innovation and exhaustion, and the wild, unpredictable nature of history itself. By the spring of 1918, the Western Front had become a grim tableau of mud, blood, and endless trenches. For years of brutal, grinding warfare had drained armies and civilians alike. You could almost feel the weariness pressing down on everyone, the kind of exhaustion that settles into bones and souls. The stalemate seemed unbreakable. Hopes were thin and fragile. But beneath that heaviness, a shift was quietly taking shape. Enter the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, fresh, energetic, and full of a restless kind of optimism. Though initially untested on this scale, their arrival brought more than just manpower. It injected new life into a weary Allied coalition. And honestly, that was exactly what was needed to shake the war loose from its muddy deadlock. At the same time, the Allies had learned some hard lessons. War wasn't just about holding the line anymore. It was about moving, striking hard and fast, and keeping relentless pressure on a weary enemy. These last months would prove to be a test not only of military might, but also of endurance, innovation, and sheer human will. Let's zoom in on two key battles that signaled America's arrival as a formidable fighting force. First stop, Below Wood, June 1918. The thick, tangled forest near the Marne River, where American Marines faced a ferocious German offensive. Picture this: inexperienced American soldiers, many barely out of training camps, plunged into a nightmare of machine gun fire, artillery explosions, and the infamous barbed wire defenses. It wasn't just a battle. It was a brutal test of character and spirit. The fighting was intense, chaotic, and deeply personal. The Marines, later dubbed Devil Dogs, shunned by their German foes for their ferocity, earned their nickname the hard way, through sheer grit and a refusal to back down. They fought inch by inch, through dense woods and under relentless shelling, turning the forest into a terrifying maze of death. But what makes Below Wood stand out isn't just the combat. It's the transformation of the American troops. These men, new to the horrors of industrial war, proved that raw courage combined with determination could hold the line against seasoned veterans. The victory here wasn't clean or easy. It was soaked in blood and sacrifice. It marked a turning point, not just tactically but psychologically for allies and enemies alike. Then came the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest American operation of the war and, honestly, one of the most staggering military efforts in history. Beginning in late September 1918 and stretching over 6 weeks, this offensive involved over 1 million American soldiers pushing through one of the most fortified German sectors. This wasn't some quick push. It was a grinding, brutal campaign through rugged terrain, muddy fields, and heavily fortified enemy positions. Casualties were staggering. Around 27,000 American lives lost, with hundreds of thousands more wounded or missing. The scale alone is almost unimaginable, but the human stories behind it give it a deeper, emotional weight. Soldiers fought through harsh weather, dwindling supplies, and exhaustion that must have felt relentless. But there was also a sense of purpose, a fire kindled by the belief that they were part of something bigger, the end of a nightmare. It was this mixture of fear, hope, and grim determination that powered them forward. And, of course, legends were born during these battles. Take Eddie Rickenbacker, a young pilot who became America's top ace with 26 confirmed kills, embodying the daring spirit of the AEF. Or the Marines' tenacity, which left a mark on the Allied cause and on military history forever. Below Wood and Meuse-Argonne weren't just battles. They were the forge where America's military identity was shaped, proving that they weren't just fresh recruits. They were a crucial, battle-tested force in the Allies' final push. So, what exactly made the 100 Days Offensive so decisive? After years of static, attritional trench warfare, the Allies switched gears, bringing a new energy to the battlefield with better coordination, fresh tactics, and more sophisticated use of technology. Think of it as the difference between shoving a boulder uphill with bare hands versus using a pulley system. Tanks, airplanes, artillery, and infantry began working in concert like never before. This was modern combined arms warfare in action. The offensive kicked off in August 1918 and was basically a non-stop, relentless push against German lines. Instead of hunkering down and defending every inch, the Allies moved fast, keeping the Germans off balance. Town after town, trench after trench, they advanced, often in terrible conditions, under constant fire. It was exhausting for soldiers on both sides. Imagine running forward under rain-soaked skies, shellfire exploding nearby, while knowing any misstep could be your last. Yet despite fatigue and fear, this was the moment soldiers sensed victory was within reach. The enemy line wasn't just holding, it was cracking. Here's the thing. The 100 Days Offensive wasn't a single battle, but a series of linked operations stretching across the Western Front, from Amiens to the Belgian border. Each victory built momentum, a domino effect that shattered German morale and defenses piece by piece. One detail people often overlook is how the use of new tactics like creeping artillery barges, where shells would move just ahead of the infantry, combined with tanks smashing through barbed wire, transformed how battles were fought. The war was evolving fast, and those who adapted survived. But beyond tech and tactics, this offensive was about sheer persistence. The Allies didn't give the Germans a moment's rest. It's almost like they were squeezing a sponge, tightening the grip until the enemy had nothing left to give. While the Allies pressed their advantage, Germany's partners were unraveling fast. It's a classic case of a house of cards tumbling when the key supports give way. First, Bulgaria surrendered in September 1918. For a country already strained by war and shortages, defeat was almost inevitable. The collapse of Bulgaria sent shockwaves through the Central Powers. If their southern flank was gone, what hope remained? Then the Ottoman Empire, a giant on life support, crumbled. Years of internal divisions, war exhaustion, and repeated military defeats left the empire in chaos. The Arab Revolt, British advances, and internal revolts pushed the Ottomans to the brink. By October, they were signing armistice agreements. Austria-Hungary was arguably the most fragile link. The empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups, many of whom had little loyalty to the Habsburg monarchy. Nationalist movements were gaining ground, and with the military faltering, the empire began to fracture. By the war's end, Austria-Hungary was essentially disintegrated, its empire dissolving into new nations. Losing these allies wasn't just a military problem for Germany, it was a psychological blow. Suddenly, Germany stood almost alone, surrounded by enemies with dwindling resources and no reinforcements. The domino effect was brutal and swift, and it made the German army's position untenable. Now, here's a piece that hits close to home. Germany's internal collapse wasn't just about the battlefield. The country itself was reaching a breaking point. You've heard of the famous Kiel Mutiny, right? German sailors refused orders to launch a last, desperate naval attack. That moment was more than defiance. It was a spark that ignited a wider revolution. Across Germany, workers and soldiers began striking, protesting, and outright refusing to fight. Cities like Berlin and Munich became hotbeds of unrest. Factories slowed or shut down, and the military's discipline began unraveling. Think about the psychological weight. Years of war, hunger, cold, and fear, and now the people were saying enough. Letters from German soldiers revealed deep despair and disillusionment. No longer did they see the war as honorable or winnable. It was a grim trap, draining the life from a once proud nation. This internal chaos compounded military losses. Without support from home, and with morale plummeting, the German army was fighting a losing battle on two fronts: the enemy outside and rebellion inside. Put it all together, and the picture is clear. The Allied counterattacks in 1918 were relentless, coordinated, and fueled by fresh energy and innovation. American troops proved themselves in bloody battles. The 100 Days Offensive kept the pressure so intense it broke the German lines, and the collapse of Germany's allies left the Central Powers isolated. At the same time, Germany's own home front was fracturing. Mutinies and strikes sapped its strength from within. It was a perfect storm of military might and human collapse. These final months weren't just the end of a war. They were a test of endurance, spirit, and the complicated human cost of conflict. The price paid was enormous, but the Allies' ability to keep pushing despite exhaustion and loss was what finally turned the tide. And when the guns finally fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the world was forever changed. The bitter sacrifices of those last struggles cast long shadows, shaping a new era, one of both hope and hard lessons. After 4 brutal years of mud, blood, and endless artillery thunder, the world was exhausted in ways that words barely capture. By late 1918, the Great War had ground down millions of soldiers and civilians alike, leaving a landscape that looked less like Europe and more like a shattered mosaic of hopes, dreams, and despair. But the question on everyone's mind was this: how exactly do you stop such a relentless storm? The answer wasn't simple, and it certainly wasn't immediate. Behind the scenes, an intense dance of diplomacy unfolded. Shadowy meetings, secret letters, and hurried conversations over smoky cigars. The Allies weren't even fully on the same page. The British, French, and Americans had different ideas about how the war should end. The Central Powers, meanwhile, were crumbling under military pressure and domestic unrest. Then there was Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president with a vision that seemed almost too idealistic for a war so soaked in brutality. His 14 points, delivered in January 1918, laid out a framework for peace that was in many ways revolutionary. No secret treaties, freedom of the seas, self-determination for nations, and, most famously, a League of Nations to ensure mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity. Sounds like the blueprint for utopia, right? Well, sort of. Wilson's ideas were a breath of fresh air, but the reality on the ground was far messier. The European powers had their own grudges and agendas. The British and French wanted reparations and security guarantees. The Germans and Austro-Hungarians, though battered, weren't ready to surrender unconditionally. And Wilson's hope for peace with justice clashed with harsh demands for victory. You can almost imagine the scene like a tense group chat filled with conflicting opinions, half-truths, and the looming threat of the conversation spiraling into chaos. Oh, and don't forget the press. Leaks and rumors whipped the public into frenzies on both sides. Newspapers spun stories of hope and horror, often exaggerating or downplaying the delicate talks behind closed doors. Here's the thing. The 14 points would eventually shape the peace talks, but they were never fully embraced. If Wilson's ideas had gone viral like a hashtag today, they'd be trending under hashtag peace plan goals. But realpolitik isn't so easily hashtagged. Still, they planted a seed, a sort of moral compass amid the wreckage. Meanwhile, time was running out. The Central Powers' internal chaos, strikes, food shortages, revolutions, hastened the end. The Allies pushed forward, sensing victory but also craving peace, the kind that meant no more sons shipped off to die in muddy trenches. Both sides knew the war was unsustainable. And then, finally, the armistice talks began. November 11th, 1918. The date has an almost magical ring to it, doesn't it? At the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns were ordered to fall silent across the Western Front. But here's something most folks don't realize. That moment wasn't some spontaneous burst of peace. It was the end result of painstaking negotiations, fraught with tension, second-guessing, and, honestly, some pretty theatrical drama. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne, northern France. Hardly a glamorous spot, but history rarely is. The German delegation arrived under uneasy terms, facing Allied commanders who held most of the cards. The signing itself was tense. Everyone knew the stakes. Once the ink dried, the countdown began. But how did the news spread? There were no smartphones buzzing with alerts, no social media feeds exploding in real time. Instead, word traveled through a patchwork of runners, telegraphs, whistles, and bells. Soldiers in the trenches heard the ceasefire orders through crackling radios or whispered orders. Civilians gathered in streets, waiting for confirmation. Of course, not all fighting ceased immediately. Ironically, some skirmishes and artillery fire continued right up to, and even after, the 11 a.m. deadline, a tragic reminder that even in peace, chaos can linger. Some units didn't get the word in time. Others simply couldn't believe the war was really over. When silence finally fell, it was deafening. The absence of gunfire was a presence itself, a strange, heavy quiet that pressed in on soldiers' ears, filling the space where explosions had lived for years. There's something powerful about silence after noise, isn't there? It's like when a crowded room suddenly hushes, and you become hyper-aware of your own breath. People celebrated, wildly and wildly differently. Some towns erupted in joyous parades, while others wept quietly. Across the ocean, Americans toasted victory and mourned loss in the same breath. The world had survived, but the price was written in the scars on countless faces and in the bones buried in foreign soil. If you think the end of the war was purely a moment of relief and celebration, you're only telling half the story. For millions of soldiers, that silence was tangled with a mix of emotions. Relief, sure, but also grief and a deep, gnawing emptiness. Imagine surviving hell on earth only to find yourself thrust into a quiet that feels almost unnatural. Some soldiers were ecstatic, clutching letters from home and dreaming of the farm, the factory, or the family waiting. Others felt lost, unsure of who they were without the structure of battle. The grief was impossible to escape. Letters home tell us about comrades who never made it, friends cut down in mud and blood. There was guilt, too, survivor's guilt, that shadow that whispered, "Why me and not them?" And there was trauma, a word few understood then, but what we now know as PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, and silence that screamed louder than any gun. Many wrote about the strange transition. 1 minute you're in the trenches, the next you're supposed to go back to normal life. It wasn't simple. Some clung to rituals or kept mementos, a bullet, a scrap of uniform, a faded photograph, as lifelines to the past. Still, there were moments of celebration. Songs broke out around campfires, impromptu football games, shared rations passed around with laughter and tears. But beneath it all was a fragile humanity trying to piece itself back together. Here's a thought. Maybe that mix of relief and sorrow, celebration and mourning, is the most honest way to understand the end of any war. Because even in peace, some wounds don't heal overnight. When you think about World War I, what comes to mind? Trenches, mud, thunderous artillery? Maybe the iconic images of soldiers frozen in time, faces etched with exhaustion and determination. But what about the staggering human cost? The toll so vast it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. 16 million dead. Millions more wounded, shattered, changed forever. And the price didn't stop at bodies and bones. It rippled through economies, cultures, and minds in ways we're still untangling today. Let's be honest. Numbers alone don't tell the story. 16 million deaths. That's almost incomprehensible. But what did it mean to be one of those millions? Or to live in a world haunted by that loss? To understand WWI's cost, we need to step beyond statistics and into the lives, the economies, and the psyche of a world forever altered. The staggering figure of 16 million dead includes both military personnel and civilians. The war wasn't some far-off event confined to battlefields. It reached into villages, cities, and homes across continents. Millions of soldiers marched off to fight, many never to return, while entire civilian populations suffered under bombings, starvation, and disease. What's even more jarring is the sheer scale of injuries, not all visible. Millions returned home, missing limbs, blinded, deafened, or physically scarred beyond recognition. Medical advances, like antiseptics and improved surgical techniques, did save lives, but often survivors were left with lifelong disabilities. And the invisible wounds? Those were just beginning to be understood. The term shell shock emerged during this war, a crude way to describe what we now call PTSD. Soldiers who'd seen unspeakable horrors came back emotionally broken, haunted by memories that refused to fade. These were wounds you couldn't stitch up or plaster over. Families often didn't know how to deal with men who'd survived battle but lost pieces of themselves. Let me share a story here. Take the case of Henry, a British soldier who survived the Somme but came home utterly changed. He couldn't sleep, shouted at shadows, and was terrified of loud noises. His family didn't understand it then. They called it weakness. Today, we recognize that as the deep psychological cost of war. War is expensive, no surprise there. But the true economic damage of World War I went far beyond the battlefield. Across Europe, cities lay in ruins, factories destroyed, farms abandoned. The cost of rebuilding was staggering. Countries found themselves buried in debt, forced to borrow heavily, sometimes from the very nations they had just fought. Take France and Belgium, where whole regions were flattened. Farmland turned into wasteland, industries halted, transportation networks severed. This destruction wasn't just physical. It disrupted food supplies, commerce, and jobs. Ordinary people found themselves struggling with shortages, inflation, and uncertainty about the future. National debts skyrocketed. Britain, France, Germany, Italy, all of them faced mountains of debt from financing the war effort. Governments printed money, leading to inflation that ate away at savings and wages. The ripple effects? Unemployment surged, poverty deepened, and social unrest simmered. Here's the kicker. The Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations from Germany that many historians say planted the seeds for the next global conflict. But for the average family in war-torn countries, this translated to higher taxes, less work, and a precarious existence. You might wonder, how did regular folks cope? Imagine a family where the father never returned, the mother had to stretch meager resources, and the children went hungry. That was everyday life for millions. And it's a side of the war that often gets lost behind tales of generals and battles. If the physical wounds of World War I were horrific, the emotional toll was equally devastating and maybe even more complex. The phrase lost generation wasn't just a literary flourish. It described an entire generation of young men who went to war with hope and returned disillusioned, broken, or not at all. The trauma ran deep, influencing everything from poetry to paintings to politics. Shell shock, as mentioned earlier, was the earliest recognition of psychological trauma caused by war. But understanding was limited. Many sufferers were stigmatized, accused of cowardice, or simply ignored. For them, life after the war was a struggle against memories that refused to stay buried. This emotional devastation spilled over into culture. Writers like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon penned haunting poems that captured the horror and futility of war. Artists painted scenes soaked with grief and alienation. The very fabric of society seemed to fray. You know what's striking? Even the nations themselves felt this trauma collectively. Countries mourned millions, but beyond grief, there was a profound sense of loss. Loss of innocence, loss of faith in progress and reason. The war shattered many assumptions about human nature and society. How do you rebuild a world after that? The question haunted governments and citizens alike for years. Just when the guns fell silent in November 1918, another killer swept across the globe. The infamous 1918 influenza pandemic, often called the Spanish flu. Here's the thing. War didn't just end with peace treaties. Troop movements, overcrowded camps, and weakened immune systems created perfect breeding grounds for the virus. It spread faster and deadlier than almost anything before it. Estimates suggest the flu killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, potentially more than the war itself. Whole communities were devastated again, grieving twice over. Hospitals overwhelmed, funerals hastened, lives snatched in their prime. The pandemic's social impact was enormous. Fear and isolation gripped societies already exhausted by years of war. People lived in constant dread, unsure if the next cough might be the last. And unlike war, this enemy was invisible and relentless. Interestingly, despite the scale, the pandemic is often overshadowed in history books. Perhaps it's because the war had such a dramatic narrative of battles and heroes, while the flu was silent, indiscriminate, and often ignored by the media at the time. So after all this loss, human, economic, psychological, what does it all mean? World War I didn't just take lives, it reshaped societies. The economic devastation led to political upheavals, including revolutions and the rise of extremist movements. The psychological trauma seeped into culture and collective memory, influencing art, literature, and even political decisions for decades. Countries rebuilt, but never quite returned to what they were before. The lost generation wasn't just a phrase. It was a reality of shattered families, broken dreams, and altered futures. And let's not forget the pandemic, which compounded the suffering and changed public health responses worldwide. In the end, the cost of World War I wasn't just in the trenches. It was in every shattered home, every economy staggering under debt, every mind haunted by memories. Remembering these costs reminds us that war's consequences are far-reaching, and the price paid by generations before us is a warning, a lesson etched in blood and loss. The end of World War I didn't exactly come with fireworks and cheers. Instead, the guns went silent on November 11th, 1918, but what followed was a tense, messy scramble to figure out what comes next. The war had shredded Europe in ways nobody quite imagined. Millions dead, economies ruined, societies shaken to their core. And in Paris, in the spring of 1919, the world's most powerful leaders gathered for the biggest peace conference the planet had ever seen. It was a chance to redraw borders, assign blame, and, if you believe the speeches, forge a new era of peace. But here's the thing. Peace, it turned out, was never just about signing papers. It was a tangle of grudges, dreams, conflicting visions, and egos the size of empires themselves. The Treaty of Versailles, born from that conference, promised to seal the peace, but ended up shaping much of the turmoil that defined the next few decades. So, what really happened behind those grand halls? Who shaped the treaty? And why does it still stir debates nearly a century later? Let me take you on that journey, through the tangled agendas of the Big Three, the infamous war guilt clause, the staggering reparations, the redrawing of maps, and the hope and heartbreak of the League of Nations. Buckle up, it's quite the story. The Paris Peace Conference felt a bit like the world's most tense poker game. Three main players with very different hands, all bluffing, negotiating, and sometimes outright butting heads. Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger France had been battered, twice invaded by Germany in recent memory, and Clemenceau wasn't about to let that happen again. His nickname, the Tiger, fit because he was fierce, relentless, and obsessed with securing France's future safety. Clemenceau wanted Germany punished hard. No ifs, no buts. To him, the treaty was about keeping France safe and ensuring Germany could never threaten Europe again. Woodrow Wilson, USA the idealist, then there was Wilson, a man whose vision was straight out of a dreamer's handbook. His famous 14 points promised a peace based on fairness, self-determination, and international cooperation through a new League of Nations. Wilson wasn't blind to the horrors of war, but honestly, he was a bit naive about the gritty European power politics. He wanted peace, but his vision often clashed with the hard realities on the ground. David Lloyd George, The pragmatist Britain's prime minister, was caught in the middle. On one hand, British public opinion was furious. Many demanded harsh treatment of Germany. On the other, Britain's empire and economy depended on a stable Europe, not one completely devastated. Lloyd George was a master of balance, wanting Germany weakened, but not so crushed it turned into a breeding ground for future chaos. And here's where it gets tricky. These three leaders dominated the conversation, sidelining other nations like Italy and Japan, who had their own ambitions and grudges. That's when resentment started to simmer. Smaller voices felt ignored, sowing the seeds of future conflicts. So, imagine a room full of titans, each dragging their own baggage, trying to write a piece everyone could live with. Spoiler, it wasn't easy. Now, if you ever heard anyone grumble about the war guilt clause, you're probably thinking about Article 231, the part of the treaty that made Germany officially accept responsibility for causing the war. This little paragraph became infamous, not just in Germany, but worldwide. Why? Because it felt like a massive insult, a public shaming that Germany alone was the bad guy. But the truth? It was never that simple. Was Germany solely responsible? Honestly, no war in history has a neat, one-sided cause. The European powers have been entangled in alliances, arms races, colonial rivalries, and nationalistic fervor for decades. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was a spark, sure, but the whole continent was a tinderbox. Yet, the Allies needed a legal foundation to justify reparations, and this clause served exactly that purpose. It said, Germany started this, so you're paying. For many Germans, it felt like a slap in the face, igniting bitterness and a sense of unfairness that would echo into the 1930s. So, here's the catch. The clause was both a legal tool and a political message. It made Germany the scapegoat, but it also oversimplified a complex web of causes, a simplification that proved dangerously combustible. You know how you get a phone bill after a wild night out and wonder, how did this get so high? Well, reparations were the world's biggest, most expensive bill after World War I, and Germany was stuck with the tab. The treaty set reparations at a staggering amount, originally around 132 billion gold marks, roughly $33 billion at the time, a sum so huge it's hard to grasp. France, having lost devastated regions and millions of lives, pushed hardest for these payments to rebuild. Britain, too, needed to shore up its battered economy. But Germany? The country was in ruins. Hyperinflation wiped out savings. Factories struggled. Political unrest boiled over. Imagine a whole nation squeezed dry, forced to pay debts that seemed endless. This wasn't just about money. It hit German pride and identity hard. Ordinary people felt crushed, humiliated, and desperate. That desperation created fertile ground for extremist voices promising to undo Versailles injustice. If you want to see how a punitive peace can backfire, reparations are the textbook example. Instead of lasting stability, they fueled resentment and economic chaos, a ticking time bomb. If you like puzzles, you'd have loved the post-war peace conference. The map of Europe was shredded, and the task was to piece it back together, but with new shapes. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was no more, the Ottoman Empire was in retreat, and new nations emerged like phoenixes, or sometimes more like awkward teenagers. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Poland, and others carved out of the old empires. But here's the kicker. These borders didn't always make sense on the ground. Sudeten Germans found themselves in Czechoslovakia, Poles in areas claimed by Germany, and ethnic groups thrown together with historical grudges simmering beneath the surface. And overseas, the colonial game continued under the guise of mandates. The League of Nations granted Britain and France control over former Ottoman territories like Palestine and Syria. Promises to locals about independence were often ignored, sparking nationalist movements that would roar decades later. It was, frankly, a mess, a patchwork with loose threads. The map may have been redrawn on paper, but the realities on the ground were far from settled. Wilson's big dream? The League of Nations, an international club, designed to keep peace through dialogue and cooperation. Sounds pretty modern, right? A world body where countries hash out problems rather than resort to war? For 1919, this was revolutionary. People were genuinely hopeful. But here's where irony steps in. The United States, Wilson's own country, never joined the League. Political opponents at home rejected it, fearing loss of sovereignty. So, the League started with one glaring omission. Add to that the fact it had no real army, no enforcement power. It relied on nations' goodwill and moral pressure. Not exactly a strong deterrent when powerful countries had their own agendas. In the 1930s, when Japan invaded Manchuria and Italy attacked Abyssinia, Ethiopia, the League stumbled, failing to act decisively. Many began to see it as toothless, more of a talking shop than a guardian of peace. Still, it laid important groundwork for what would come next, the United Nations. The idea that peace requires institutions, not just treaties. So, what did the Treaty of Versailles really achieve? It was meant to bring justice, secure lasting peace, and prevent another war. But the reality was far messier. The treaty balanced on a knife edge between punishing Germany and trying to rebuild Europe, and it ended up pleasing few. For Germany, it was humiliation and hardship. For France, a security measure that felt never quite enough. For Britain, a pragmatic compromise. For the world, a peace that was uneasy and uneasy at best. Did it cause World War II? Historians still debate, but there's no doubt the treaty's harsh terms fueled nationalist resentment and economic instability that extremists exploited. More than anything, Versailles shows how peace after a brutal war is never simple. It's an emotional, political tangle, and sometimes the peace laid down on paper becomes the spark for the next conflict. Looking back from now, it's tempting to see the Treaty of Versailles as a what not to do guide. But it's also a story about human ambition, fear, hope, and the messy reality of trying to put broken pieces back together. Those leaders in Paris were wrestling with impossible choices, trying to satisfy millions of wounded people, rebuild shattered countries, and prevent future wars. They failed in some ways, succeeded in others. Today, peace talks, ceasefires, and treaties still echo those struggles. The Treaty of Versailles reminds us that peace isn't a moment. It's a process fragile and ongoing, shaped by history, politics, and human nature. And honestly, if we forget that, history has a way of reminding us, sometimes painfully. The years after World War I weren't calm. They were restless, full of smoldering tensions and quiet resentments just waiting for a spark. This uneasy peace set the stage for what would come next. And honestly, the roots of the next great conflict were already tangled deep in the ashes of the last. The grievances, the economic chaos, the wild rise of extremist politics, and the myths spun about the war. All these forces collided to create a perfect storm. Let's unpack how these seeds took root and eventually sprouted into another catastrophic war. Imagine living in a country that just lost a war nobody wanted to accept losing. That was Germany in the aftermath of 1918. The fledgling Weimar Republic emerged from the rubble, a democratic experiment in a land still reeling from defeat and humiliation. Yet, from the very start, those democratic hopes felt more like a gamble than a guarantee. You see, Germany's political landscape was fragmented like a shattered mirror. On one side, you had moderate Democrats trying to build stability to stitch together a future. On the other, fierce radicals, both from the left and right, were ready to tear down whatever they saw as weak or betraying the nation. Street violence became a daily occurrence. Paramilitary groups clashed in cities, and political assassinations lurked in the background like dark shadows. This wasn't just about politics, it was about pride. Wounded pride. There was a paradox here. Despite having been decisively defeated, many Germans felt they hadn't truly lost. They saw themselves as betrayed by their leaders, stabbed in the back by traitors at home, rather than overwhelmed on the battlefield. This stab in the back myth wasn't just conspiracy fodder. It shaped how millions understood their past and their future. It fed an angry undercurrent that would eventually help extremist voices rise. Now, this anger wasn't just whispered in dark corners. It seeped into the culture. Films and literature of the time brimmed with bitterness and a longing to reclaim lost honor. Propaganda machines revved up, using art and media to fan the flames of resentment. It's wild how much a society's stories and symbols can sway its collective mood, right? The narrative you buy into, whether about victory, defeat, or betrayal, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Speaking of bitter, the economic roller coaster in post-war Germany was no picnic. One moment, things seemed to hold steady. The next, the whole system threatened to collapse beneath people's feet. The 1920s were a decade of sharp contrasts, and not just the roaring jazz and flapper dresses you might picture from America. For many Germans, it was a time of extreme hardship and uncertainty. Take the infamous hyperinflation of 1923, for example. Imagine going to a market with a wheelbarrow full of money just to buy a loaf of bread, and by the time you get home, the price has doubled. That's what hyperinflation looked like in real life. A nightmare where your currency loses value faster than you can spend it. Entire life savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless, and trust in institutions crumbled. The government tried to patch things up with plans like the Dawes Plan, which brought in foreign loans to stabilize the economy. But it was more like a band-aid on a broken leg, temporarily helpful, but far from a cure. Then, as if fate had a cruel sense of timing, the global Great Depression hit in 1929, crushing economies worldwide and hitting Germany especially hard. Unemployment skyrocketed, businesses shuttered, and desperation spread like wildfire. The economic collapse wasn't just about numbers on paper. It ripped through families, farms, and neighborhoods. Veterans who had survived the trenches now faced a different battlefield: joblessness and poverty. Farmers, once proud providers, saw their livelihoods sink. The social fabric began to tear, and in those gaps, radical ideas found fertile soil. When people are desperate, promises of easy answers and strong leadership become incredibly tempting. Around this time, a new player began to dominate the stage: fascism. Italy's Benito Mussolini had already marched his black shirts to power, showing the world that violent, nationalist politics could reshape a country. Germany watched closely, and homegrown groups like the Nazi Party began to attract attention. The Nazis started out as a fringe movement, but their message, national revival, revenge for humiliation, and a fierce rejection of the post-war order, struck a chord. Their rallies were like theatrical spectacles, complete with flags, uniforms, and stirring speeches. It was propaganda turned into performance art, designed to grip emotions and sweep people into a collective trance. Meanwhile, the streets were battlegrounds. The Sturmabteilung, or SA, acted as the party's muscle, intimidating opponents and creating chaos under the guise of restoring order. This wasn't just politics, it was a clash of visions for Germany's soul. The more unstable things got, the more appealing it seemed to some to trade messy democracy for strong leadership. But Germany wasn't alone. Across Europe, militant nationalism was on the rise. Fascism's allure wasn't unique to one country. It was a response to broader anxieties about modernity, identity, and power. People craved certainty in uncertain times, even if it came wrapped in uniforms and fiery rhetoric. Speaking of the past haunting the present, the millions of veterans returning home carried more than just medals and scars. They returned to a world that didn't quite know how to welcome them back. Veterans groups popped up, offering camaraderie and a shared sense of loss. But these groups also became hotbeds of political radicalization. The stab in the back myth was particularly powerful in veteran circles. It told a story where Germany's defeat wasn't on the battlefield, but betrayed from within by politicians, socialists, and Jews, according to the narrative pushed by extremists. This myth was more than false history. It was a weapon to undermine democracy and justify revenge. The legacy of the war was also etched deep in art, literature, and public memory. Poets and painters captured the horror and the heartbreak, but sometimes the war was romanticized, painted as a noble sacrifice rather than a brutal nightmare. This romanticization risked glorifying conflict and made it easier for the next generation to be drawn into militaristic fervor. If you think about it, the struggles of veterans after World War I echo through history. Whether it's after Vietnam, Iraq, or Afghanistan, societies wrestle with how to support soldiers returning from trauma and loss. The difference here is how these myths and memories were weaponized to fuel political extremism. So here's the thing: resentment, economic hardship, political chaos, and haunting myths weren't isolated issues. They wove together into a volatile mix. Each piece made the others worse. Economic despair made people desperate for answers. Political instability made radical ideas seem plausible. War myths gave those ideas a historical reason to rally behind. The world at large missed the warning signs or chose to ignore them, believing the peace was solid. But beneath the surface, those seeds were already sprouting, turning into poisonous vines that would strangle democracy and freedom. Reflecting on this period makes you realize how history sometimes repeats or at least echoes itself. The lessons? They're loud and clear if we listen. Watch for bitter grievances left unresolved. Be wary of economic desperation. And remember how powerful stories and myths can be in shaping a nation's future. Understanding these roots isn't just an academic exercise. It's a reminder that peace is fragile, and the battles after the battles often matter just as much.